Cade Productions presents an original Star Wars story. Legacies End, Book 3, Return of the Whills, written by Gregory O. Scott. Cade Skywalker and company have finally tracked down Khat Lah, the Yuuzhan Vong mystic who has uncovered shocking revelations about the Force. Meanwhile, Ania Solo plots a rescue of her cousin, deposed Empress Marasiah Fel. Prelude. A long time ago. Akherkesh was striking no matter how many times one had seen it. The tall butte on which it sat rose hundreds of meters from the sea, isolated and majestic. Water, pumped to the rock formation's highest layers by ancient engineering, fell in steady curtains down its side and back to the sea. On the flat top, 8 tall rectangular monoliths sat arranged around a shallow pool. It was a place of symmetry and grace, and many counted the Temple of Balance as the most holy of the Jedi centers on Tython. Tython's last though hung above Akherkesh as if to accentuate the point. The massive ark, 8 triangular sides arranged as a double pyramid of black stone, hovered in the air through powers unknown. Over 10,000 years ago, 8 other though had converged on Tython from different corners of the galaxy, bearing with them pilgrims from dozens of planets and species that could touch the Force. These pilgrims became Jedi, and for 10,000 years the though had hung above their temples, silent and inscrutable, the most prominent of Tython's many mysteries. After 10,000 years, that had finally changed. As she stood beside the shallow pool that topped Akherkesh, Lenori Brock, Jedi Ranger, had a hard time drawing her attention from the though reflection in the still water. With effort, she forced her eyes off the double pyramid and onto the semicircle of Jedi masters who stood around her and her companions. The experiments we've run have all been successful. The test flights have shown our Jedi pilots are capable of controlling the craft, said the man beside her. There's no reason to delay the mission any further. We should depart as soon as the ship has been stocked for a long-term journey. Tave, the Nori combat master of Stav Kesh, said, a long-term mission, Master Quan Jang. Let us be honest with each other. The journey you propose is almost certainly one way. That's possible, Quan Jang admitted. But I am not proposing this mission. I'm ready to carry it out, personally. All I need is your blessing. The middle-aged human, dark-skinned, bald, with black lenses over his eyes was the temple master of Anilkesh, center of Jedi scientific research. Since the defeat of the Rakuten invaders a year ago, and the flight of all but one though to Fury's Gate, outermost planet of the Titan system, Quan Jang had led efforts to understand and repair Rakuten technology gathered from their crashed starships. And after a year of experimentation, one Rakuten gunship had finally been made operable. With that technology, they stood able to do what no Jedi had done in 10,000 years, breach lightspeed and explore the galaxy beyond. And Lenori Brock was set to go with them. From his tone, Quan Jang made it clear he intended to do whatever was necessary to begin the journey, and soon. Lenori understood his urgency. The war within the Rakuten had fundamentally changed the Jedi. In addition to opening to the door to the wider galaxy, it had opened doors in themselves, not all good. Many Jedi, led by war hero Yuuzhan Vong, were convinced they needed to embrace the strength and passions traditionally associated with Tython's dark moon, Bogan. Others eschewed balance in the other direction, favoring the purity associated with the light moon, Ashla. Exploration of the galaxy beyond the Tython system was the one thing both sides agreed on, but that could change fast. Quan Jang wanted to get the mission going before the strife among the Jedi deepened. Master Tave turned his small, intense eyes on the 2 Jedi Rangers standing beside Quan Jang. This mission may well take you from Tython forever. You will never see this world. You will never speak to your families. You will likely die among strangers. Have you prepared yourself for that? The Twi'lek on Quan Jang's other shoulder raised his head. Accepting risk is a part of being a Jedi, and all of us have faced death during the invasion. 28 Jedi have volunteered for this mission. None of us are afraid. This is true, said the stout Talon master Lha, but your motivations are particularly strong, aren't they, Hulkrio? The Twi'lek exhaled and allowed himself to look skyward. Lanori did too. Of the 9 Thoyur that had sat above Tython for 10,000 years, 3 had been destroyed by the Rakata. 5 had fled to Fury's Gate and appeared to wait there, expecting companions to join them in a journey to the stars. Only one, the largest, remained on Tython. As it hovered over Akerkesh, Lanori could feel its strange whispers in the Force. For millennia the Thoyur had been inscrutably silent, but that had all changed at the end of the Rakatan invasion, when Hawk Ryo's niece Tasha, a young Jedi seer, had sacrificed her body and infused all 9 Thoyur with her Force essence. In doing so she'd awaken them. First they'd become weapons that ravaged the Rakata and drove them to retreat. Now the Thoyur, with pieces of Tasha Ryo inside, stood poised to become guides. Over the past year, all the Jedi training on this expedition had spent days meditating atop this butte, attuning themselves to the Thoyur so they might be better guided by it in the journey to come. For Hawk Ryo, communing with the essence of his niece had been easiest, but was also painfully personal. Hawk took a breath and turned his eyes back to the Masters. I am determined to see this through. When the Thoyur left Tython, I felt Tasha reach out and beckon me. We were meant to follow. I strongly believe this is the next step the creators of the Thoyur have planned for us. I do as well, added Quan Jang. The mysterious creators, sighed the Cather Dampao. She'd been Lanori's teacher and closest friend among the Masters for many years. With Quan Jang leaving, she stood ready to take over research on Anil Kesh. She fixed knowing eyes on Lanori and said, "You were the second Jedi after Ranger Hawk to request to join the expedition. Can you speak to your reasons, Ranger Brock?" Dampao knew Lanori's reasons and how intensely personal they were. Lanori's brother Dalian had abandoned his Jedi training out of an obsession with reaching beyond the Tython system. Just before the Rakatan invasion, Lanori had been forced to kill him to prevent him from using an ancient Gree device he believed would activate a hypergate in the ruins of Tython's old city. Because Dal couldn't, just thinking on that was painful. She told the Masters, exploring outside the Tython system will not only tell us about the Rakata and other enemies that might come for us again. It could also lead us to the truth behind our origins. I think the Thoyur are continuing the next phase of whatever mission they were designed for. We were meant to follow them as much as we were meant to be on Tython. Do you think it's the fate of all Jedi to follow them to the stars? Asked Rajivari, another human master. One day, I think it will be. But for now, the least we can do is mount an exploratory expedition. She added gravity to her tone. Whatever we learn there could be essential for holding the Jedi together. That drew uncomfortable emotions from the Masters. Though they wouldn't say so in a formal setting like this, they all knew the order was fracturing. Another question, said Rajivari, turning his eyes to Quan Jang. We know the Rakatan vessels were originally powered by harnessing the darker aspects of the Force. Prisoners were enslaved and tortured, and their agony was used to propel Rakatan warships across the stars. I've already explained how we fixed that, Quan Jang said. Through collective meditation we can keep in balance as we travel. We've had no difficulty in test flights. Around the Tython system, yes, said LHA. But for a sustained jump through lightspeed, are you sure our Jedi can endure that strain? Lanori watched Quan Jang closely. They performed several second-long lightspeed jumps within the Tython system. The Rakatan machinery was able, but she and the other Jedi had been wearied by the brief effort. Quan Jang, however, confidently said, all our tests have been successful. I believe our Jedi will have no problem piloting the ship through sustained journeys. On paths led by the Thoyur. Dampao looked to Hawk Ryo. Your attunement to the Thoyur to your niece is especially strong. Will you be navigator on this journey? That's my intention, the Twi'lek nodded. The Masters seemed to retreat into themselves. Lanori felt the Force pulse between them as they shared feelings between them. Eventually, Master Rajivari said, the Council sees no reason to delay this mission any further. You have our approval. Go with the Force. Lanori felt a swell of satisfaction from Quan Jang and a deeper determination from Hawk. She wasn't sure what to feel. Glancing upward, she tried to think on the Thoyur, all its mystery and promise. It was easier than thinking about her brother. Things proceeded quickly after that. The repaired racket and gunship, now docked at a station near Anil Kesh, was quickly filled with supplies. Lanori went to the temple at Bodhi to speak with her parents, who put a brave face on her coming disappearance and didn't mention Dal at all. Then she went to Anil Kesh for final preparations. She hadn't expected many more goodbyes. A Jedi Ranger's life was a solitary one, which was one of the reasons why she'd chosen it. She was pleased, then, to see Master Dan Powell awaiting her on the landing pad, beside a cart laden with one large supply crate. The stout old Cather was one being Lanori would miss, and it took effort to restrain herself to a polite bow. "Thank you for seeing us off, Master, and that you for having faith in our mission. Your path is a dangerous one, and despite Quan Jang's assurances, I don't wholly trust that alien monstrosity." She glanced sideways at the docked vessel. Like most Rakuten ships, it had a round central body, with 3 long angular arms jutting both fore and aft from the sphere's flanks and top side. "We've run test flights, Master. We can't control it. And if you run into its makers, we've used its weapons. And I think that though your will help us too. Not even though you are invincible. Some have already been destroyed." Lanori tried to smile. "I was hoping for a more optimistic farewell." Dan Powell sighed. "I'm just voicing my concerns, though I'm sure there's nothing you haven't thought of all already. But forget all that. I've come here to say goodbye, Lanori, and to pass on to you one more thing." She looked to the sealed crate. "Such as?" Dan Powell stepped over to it, removed a metal key from her robe, and unlocked the hatch. She peeled back the lid, and the sight took Lanori's breath away. Outwardly, it was simple. A metal sphere slightly larger than a human head. There were several ports into which objects could be injected or connected, and no other exterior features. Lanori knew it instantly as the device her brother had stolen from a site on Kalamar, tricked Selkath scientists into repairing, then taken to Tython in hopes of using as dark matter reactor to activate the supposed Gree hypergate in the old city. This was the reason she chased him across the whole Tython system. This was what Dal had died for. She could still remember the long minutes after she'd killed him, when she'd sat beside his cooling body in the ruins of the old city, staring at that device, just wondering what would happen if she tried to turn it on. Dan Powell and the other masters had said Dal was playing with things beyond understanding. They said it might trigger a singularity that would swallow the entire star system. Lanori had spent a long time wondering. Sometimes it felt like she'd never left that place. Seeing the device now brought it all back, even when Dan Powell slammed the lid shut and locked it tight. Lanori said, "You want us to take that thing with us. Why?" "Several reasons. If you're to find its original makers, be they Gree, Qua, or something else, they will be among the stars, not on Tython. Only they will be able to activate it, or dispose of it safely. Also," she breathed deep, "we believe it is no longer safe to keep this device here." Lanori blinked. "We've done everything we could to keep it secret. I even lied to my parents and told them it was destroyed. Only the most elite masters." She stopped herself, finally understanding. The masters, increasingly split between Ashla and Bogan, no longer trusted each other with the device. If she took it far, far away, neither side would be able to wreak harm with it. She'd had no idea the schism had gotten that deep or dangerous, and she feared for the planet she'd be leaving behind. Very seriously, Lanori said, "I'll guard it with my life, Master. Does anyone else know about it?" "No. Not even Ranger Hawk or Quan Jang. I leave it to you whether to tell them." Lanori put a hand on the crate and wondered how many of the council even knew what Dan Powell was doing. She wondered if her master was acting alone. She wondered if this device, the sole legacy of her brother's tragic life, would doom or save the mission. "Thank you for trusting me, Master." Dan Powell's mouth spread wide, smiled. "I trust no Jedi more than you, Lanori. Go with the Force." She took Lanori's hand between her paws, squeezed them, then turned and walked away, leaving her key in the human's palm. Lanori stared at the key, then the sealed crate, wondering. With effort, she pocketed the key, took hold of the cart, and nudged her cargo toward the waiting starship. Under his former masters, the interior of the Rakuten ship had contained a vaulted chamber filled with glass capsule containers in which prisoners had been strapped, tortured, and drained of Force energy. His new owners had given the place a makeover, but something of that remained. Capsules had been replaced with crash couches onto which Jedi voluntarily strapped themselves. Modified versions of the original Rakuten headsets were placed on their foreheads to gather the power of the Jedi's Force meld. Save for a handful of rotating crew members assigned to watch other parts of the operation, the rest of the 29 Jedi remained strapped in their beds, powering the ship as it moved through space. As a ranger, Lanori had never been good at Force melds. She had so many things she wanted to keep secret, and it was hard to let her guard down even for the limited level required for the meld. But over the past year she'd learned to do it anyway, and though uncomfortable, she was able to join with the others in directing the Rakuten gunship away from Tython. They oriented themselves toward Fury's Gate, last planet of the system and staging point for the 5th year. None of those were visible at this distance, but Lanori could faintly feel them calling to her, beckoning. At sublight speeds, the trip to Fury's Gate took over 300 standard days. With this ship, they stood ready to cross the gap in a dizzying split second. They'd run tests before, and Lanori braced herself for what she knew came next. The collective minds of the Jedi united toward that single goal. She felt the Force swell around them as the Rakuten ship warmed its lightspeed drive. Energy burst, and they fell out of the universe. They fall back in immediately. Even strapped to her crash couch, Lanori felt nausea in body and in mind. What they'd done was nothing something living beings were meant to do. It seemed to her that the whole Force groaned in protest. But they'd done it before, and they'd do it many times again. Lanori felt they were at Fury's Gate now. The 5th year were close by, beckoning. She felt Hawk Ryo's awareness emerge from the meld, individual and strong, and reach out to touch whatever remained of his niece. Tasha Rio seemed to touch back. A welcoming warmth spread through the meld, congratulating and encouraging. At the same time, she seemed to be tugging them ahead, pulling them toward a specific point in space far beyond the Tython system. This was the first step in their journey, and Lanori felt collective thrill and anxiety inside the meld. That outside presence sent them comfort again and tugged them once more in the new direction. Hawk Rio accepted the instruction and led the other Jedi in reorienting the ship. The Thoyer touched them once more, beckoning, and with a wink they were gone, vanished into lightspeed, propelled by whatever unimaginable power moved them. The Jedi had no choice but to follow. Hawk gave them a collective moment to brace themselves, then urged them forward. They plunged ahead, leaping out of the Tython system and out of the universe itself, leaving everything they'd known behind. Chapter 1. At nearly 3,000 meters from prow to stern, protected by layered shields and bristling with turbo-laser turrets and concussion missile launchers, the Star Destroyer Alliance was as potent as any warship in the galaxy. Taken alone, it would have caused an attacking fleet to slow in caution. Together with its surrounding flotilla 9 Mon Calamari warships of varying classes, plus a dozen smaller support vessels, it was the centerpiece of a formidable fighting force. Anjdal knew that, but as she angled her crossfire to view Alliance, a pale wedge against a backdrop of faint stars, the mighty flagship seemed small, lonely, and vulnerable. "Stop projecting," she muttered to herself. That kind of thinking got them nowhere. "What's that, Rogue Leader?" A voice scratched her helmet comlink. "Nothing to?" Ange restrained a sigh. She checked her scanners. Rogues 2, 3, and 4 were still behind her, keeping the perfect diamond formation they'd held for the past hour as they'd flown a lazy patrol loop around the fleet. Alliance and its support vessels were hanging in empty space, dozens of light years from any star system, inhabited or otherwise. The nice thing about space was that it was so damn big, all you had to do to hide was sit in the middle of it. The downside was that it was easy to feel lost, directionless. With their patrol complete, Ange and her wingmates had only one direction to go. "Let's pack it for home, rogues," she called, and gently added more power to engines. There, as foils already locked in a horizontal position, the 4 crossfires began a steady dive toward Alliance. As they got closer, they could plainly see the gold phoenix crests emblazoned on either flank of the big white destroyer. And still remembered the frenzied battle at the Mon Calamari shipyards in which they'd stolen the brand new, top-of-the-line ship from the Imperials. It had been Admiral Stassi's first great victory in the war against Cade, and just thinking on it brought the warm glow of nostalgia. Things were much more complicated nowadays. It had been mere days since the fleet had jumped away from Bakura. The Imperials had arrested the Admiral before anyone knew what was going on, and the Alliance fleet, which had made up the bulk of the forces liberating the planet from the SS Iruak, had been forced to make a terrible choice: fight to free their captured leader, or acquiesce, in effect surrendering Stasi to whatever fake arguments the Imperials would use to blame him for the murder of Marasiah Fel. Instead, Admiral Joram Bey had elected a third option. He pulled his ships away from Bakura and jumped them to parts unknown, leaving freshly proclaimed Regent Hogram Chalk with a powerful and potentially hostile fleet lurking somewhere among the stars. The hope was that uncertainty would debilitate Chalk. All Ange knew was that it gnawed at her pilots too. As their 4 crossfires pulled into the ventral hangar, another flight set out for patrol. The deck was mostly quiet, and a minimal deck crew shepherded the 4 starfighters into their berths. It was mere morning shipboard time, and her other pilots were ready to stretch, exercise, eat, and drink in that order. Ange envied them their freedom. She was more than a fighter jock nowadays, so after changing from flight suit to uniform standard Alliance blues, not any of the drab gray imp stuff Coruscant had tried to force on them, she made her way up to Alliance's command section. Over a decade back, Admiral Stasi had made his legendary fighting retreat from Comus, keeping the spirit of the Alliance alive even after the crushing defeat of his fleets and the surrender of his government. Ange had been just a rookie pilot then, not even out of her teens, but she could still remember the terror and thrill of that battle, and the strange high that had followed escape. The entire galaxy had turned against them, but that small handful of soldiers was alive to proudly carry the Alliance's fire. Despite the odds against them and the brutal slog to come, they felt united in their common goal. Things were different after their flight from Bakura. It wasn't just that Ange was older now, and a commander to boot. As she walked down Alliance's halls, she saw the quiet confusion on the faces of every being she passed. Unlike after Comus, nobody knew what their end goal was, where the next fight would be, or whether they'd fight at all. And as much as she admired and respected Joram Bey, she had to admit he was no Gar Stasi. When she reached the bridge, Ange exchanged salutes with the flagship's captain, the humorless but effective Captain Ona Antilles. Antilles directed her to the command salon at the rear of the bridge, and when she stepped into the separate chamber, she found exactly what she's expected: Joram Bey, thick arms locked over his chest, staring down at a holo projected from the salon central table. She gave another salute and said, "Reporting on schedule, Admiral." The Weequay glanced at his wrist chronometer. 2 minutes late, actually. "Sorry, sir. Guess I took too long getting changed." At ease. It's not like we're pressed for time. Ange lowered her hand. Bey flexed broad shoulders like he wasn't entirely comfortable with the uniform they were in. Stasi's longtime friend and right hand, Jais Yorub, had died in the battle to capture this ship, and the Admiral would have died too if Joram hadn't punched him in the jaw and literally dragged him into the cockpit of his crossfire. As both reward and punishment, Stasi had promoted Joram from Rogue Leader to Alliance's commanding officer, which had in turn gotten Ange booted up from Rogue 5 to Rogue Leader. She was fighter jockey at heart, no lover of rank or responsibility, but she knew all the weight she gathered on her shoulders were nothing compared to what her past and present commanding officer had on his. Though he'd never say it aloud, she bet Joram wanted nothing more than to tear off his rank badge and careen about in a crossfire again. "Well," Ange said, turning her attention to the holos at waist level. "What's the news for today?" "Things are getting a little clearer on Coruscant," Joram said. With a tap on the table's controls, he brought up an image of an unlovely Snivian newscaster reporting against a backdrop of Galactic City's skyline. "Regent Chalk has confirmed today that he will be holding a public trial of former Alliance Admiral Gar Stasi, as well as Senators Nellerin and Kaiga, and 3 unnamed individuals that government says are directly or indirectly involved with the murder of Empress Fel. Regent Chalk insisted the trial will be presented fairly, in public view, and welcomed all legal scrutiny from the Senate, while also warning strongly that violent protest will be harshly punished. Speaker T.M. Brighton, a longtime ally of the accused, has promised a thorough legal defense and peaceful protests. In his statement, Regent Chalk also reiterated his call for fugitive Senator Porat Darrell to surrender himself for trial. He has also increased the reward for the senator's capture by another 25%. Finally, the memorial ceremony for Empress Fel will be held this afternoon at 1400 hours, Galactic Standard Time. Speaker Brighton had confirmed that he will be present at the memorial. The Jedi Order will also be sending as members to the ceremony, and we've just learned the President of the Happen Republic will be arriving soon. We'd like to remind our audience that Empress Fel's mother, Ania Solo, and the current regent were both born in the Hapes cluster, to a then noble family. About what I expected, Anne said after Jorm paused the recording. What are they saying about us? Very little, even unofficially. I'm guessing Chalk has given the Newsnets a polite but firm message not to remind their audience we're out here and liable to cause trouble. Is that what we aim to do? Cause trouble. Our aim is to secure the release of Stasi and the others from Chalk's trumped-up charges. I know, Ange let her voice go soft. But really, sir, what can we do, specifically? It sounds like Brighton's legal team is the best chance they have of stopping this thing. Chalk would never have arrested the Admiral if he hadn't concocted an airtight case. The Admiral? Jorm always referred to Stasi like that, as if he wasn't an admiral himself. His rough weak-way face hid how overwhelmed he felt from most beings, but not from her. Do you think it's possible, she ventured, that some of the other senators were in on it? They've published those images of Stasi meeting with Darrell. Yes, the Admiral and a senator, sulking in a dark alley. Jorm shook his head. I still wager those were fakes, and not the last bit of false evidence Chalk's cooked up. No, he'll use this to purge his enemies. He's not the kind of man who lets any crisis go to waste. Ange frowned. If that's the case, why is Brighton still in office? And why didn't he arrest Monia? Monia again was another ex-rogue. Niece of a late Alliance triumvir, she'd gotten out of the military and into politics, which was a new kind of fighting and just as fierce lately. Monia had been at the fore of the senators nosily but so far peaceably denouncing Chalk's actions. Chalk is a smart one, Jorm said. The Senate, and all those Alliance senators, are here to stay. He knows that. He can't destroy the body his niece fought so hard to make, but he can neuter it. Tame it. If he plays his cards right, he can cast Brighton, Monia, and the others as terrorist sympathizers, even accessories to regicide. And though I hate to say it, we may have helped his hand. How so? With us in limbo, the Alliance presence in the Federation fleet is down to a sliver. Admiral Schlosser seems to be obeying Chalk's orders and keeping his ships in the Outer Rim, cleaning up the last of the SS Siruak. He doesn't want to do anything that would spark a full-on insurrection, especially since he knows he can't win. Ange understood Jorm was talking about himself as much as the Sluicy Admiral. Have you made any contact with him? No. I don't want to give away anything yet. Our position, our plans. What plans? Ange wanted to ask, but held herself. Jorm's eyes darted from the table to her. You've thought about contacting Monia, haven't you? Ange didn't deny it. As a part-time commando unit, Rogue Squadron had used a special encrypted frequency recorded only in the heads of its members. It had proven useful in unlikely ways, including making contact with Hondo Kar's rogue Mandalorians last year. Ange might be able to call her old squad mate on that freak. Maybe it would get past Hagram Chalk's surveillance, which was sure to be focused on Monia right now. Maybe it would get caught. Honestly, she said, it doesn't seem worth the risk yet. Keep silent for now, Jorm nodded. We need to wait. Consider our options. Ange waited. When he said nothing else, she asked, what are our options, sir? Jorm snorted, amused at her bluntness. Right now we're a sword, dangling over Chalk's head, in a place he can't see. We'll keep him distracted. He'll waste resources trying to find us. And if he does find Stasi guilty, if he tries to execute him. Jorum's face darkened. We have a fleet. I'm prepared to use it to save the Admiral. We'd start another civil war if we did that. And the odds would be against us almost as bad as they were 10 years ago. Maybe worse, since the Jedi and Imperial Knights can't help us. Most of the citizens in this galaxy support democratic values, alliance values. The Senate elections show that. It's white chalk, and the Imperials are on the defensive. We've scared them, and now they're lashing out, trying to seize total power while they have any power at all. It was an accurate enough summation, but it didn't make Ange feel any better. So we hold on. We wait and watch. That's right, Joram said. And if it comes to it, be ready to strike. Anytime, any place. He tapped the table again, and the frozen news broadcast was replaced by a galactic map, marking out the placement of Imperial warships across the galaxy per Alliance's last sync with the Federation database just says ago, before the attack on Bakura. They'd been cut out of all central systems since, of course, but it still painted a grim picture. Alliance's battle group, floating on the edge of uncharted space, was just a tiny green dot against a sprawl of Imperial red. Brave fighters had overcome seemingly insurmountable odds before. A century and a half back, the Rebel Alliance had toppled Palpatine's empire. A decade ago, they toppled Kratos. This time, the battle lines were blurrier. Every action was constrained by great risk. And as she told Joram, this time there were no Jedi Knights to lead the charge with blazing swords and righteous wisdom. With the Force gone silent, the Sith eradicated, and the Jedi just helpless monks, the fate of the galaxy was in the hands of normal beings now. Anne suddenly found herself wishing for the days when conflicts were started and ended by higher powers. At least then there was always somebody else to blame. Now everything the weight of decision, the hinge of fate was on them alone. With two long thin horns jutting a straight half-meter from the crown of his skull, a Chagrian male was an easy thing to spot amidst a mixed-species crowd. Unlike other cranial appendages of Twi'lek's Leku, say, or Agado's more modest horns, the Chagrians couldn't be obscured by a hooded cloak or well-placed hat. Those tall, straight horns were like a declaration, one Chagrian men usually wore with pride, but they did no favors when trying to avoid attention. Fortunately, Chagrian females were not so handicapped. Parat Darrow, former war hero, former senator, now fugitive, had thrown on a drab tunic and painted a slashing scar mark across his face in order to assume the airs of a roughneck spacer. But not everyone on the packed pedestrian streets of Rakopia's main spaceport town was convinced. Trailing 50 meters behind him, her hornless scalp and low-hanging lathorns obscured by a black hood, Sare watched her husband's prominent horns peeking above the surrounding heads, and she watched the other watchers. She marked two of them, staggered apart and covering the left and right-hand sides of the street. They would shift position in the crowd in alternate positions, one getting close to Porat and the other hanging behind. It was a fairly standard method of trailing a target, and Sare couldn't tell who or what they were. Maybe Imperial spies, maybe bounty hunters, maybe amateurs, maybe even Sith agents, though from all she'd heard Nil was dead and his forces ravished. Over the past few days, Hogrim Chalk had made it known galaxy-wide that he wanted Senator Darrow, and was willing to pay for him. They were lucky to have gotten off Coruscant at all. Sare and her husband had been bracing for radical action ever since Darth Havoc had accosted Porat in the Senate apartment parking garage. Porat had landed a few shots on him as he fled, but Havoc's ultimate fate was unknown, and they both knew that if the Sith had been captured by the Empress people, Sare's past was no longer secret. Then two Imperial Knights had come to Porat's office to ask probing questions. As soon as they'd left, Porat had come at his wife, telling her to prep their things and get ready to leave Coruscant. Even then, they'd never imagined what would come next. The Empress assassinated, half the senior Alliance officials rounded up as her killers. They still weren't sure how all the pieces fit together. They only knew they were lucky to have gotten that warning, otherwise Porat would be in the same prison cell as Stasi. And Sare, she knew, would be in the same place as Darth Havoc, which was surely worse. After fleeing Coruscant, they stopped on Recopia's spaceport to access funds Porat kept at a private bank here. Now they were heading back to their ship, but first they had to deal with their tails. Following well behind her husband and his enemies, watching them all, Sari slipped a hand beneath her hood, tapped her earpiece, and whispered, "I see two following you. You're going to have to find a place to lose them." "It's crowded here," Porat whispered back. "There's not many places they could act. They'll follow you all the way back to the ship if you let them. You need to lure them someplace secluded." From a distance, she watched her husband's horn swing slightly to the right. "I see a place. Be ready." Sari watched as Porat's horns veered rightward, then dipped slightly to fit through a doorway beneath the sign marking a public refresher. Sari moved to the left side of the street and watched through the crowd as one of Porat's tailors, a brown-haired human, slowed and turned for the fresher, while the second, a blue-skinned Pantoran, kept walking. The Pantoran slowed once he passed the building, stopped in the middle of the street, made a show of confusion, then moved to the left side of the street. He leaned against the side of the building facing the outhouse and took out his datapad, as though checking it for directions. Nobody seemed to pay him attention except Sari. She tapped her comm on again. "Watch the human, brown hair. I'll take care of the one outside." The Pantoran was watching the outhouse while pretending to watch his datapad, and he didn't notice Sari at all until she slipped beside him and nudged him in the shoulder. She immediately bounced off him and offered apologies. The Pantoran grunted that she should watch where she was going. He apparently hadn't felt her needle pierce the fabric of his trousers and enter his thigh. The sedative inside was designed to render humans unconscious in less than a minute, and she imagined it would work just as well for a Pantoran. Sari crossed the street, maneuvering around the crowd until she reached the outhouse. Instead of going in, she whispered, "Outside is clear." Porat made no reply, which could have meant he was in trouble or that he was being closely watched. This was one of those times when Sari wished she could touch the Force again. For all its drawbacks, it could be such a useful tool. She released breath when Porat exited the restroom and began walking for the spaceport, paying her no attention. A second later, the brown-haired human came out as well and made a causal turn to follow the Chagrian. As he moved into the crowd, Sari fell and behind him, nudged him in the back, and slipped another needle in. The human acted more alarmed than his partner. After Sari slipped back, losing herself in the crowd, she turned again to see the human standing, looking around, either for his partner or the one who just knocked him. She whispered to her husband, "Second gift delivered. We should have a talk with him." "Agreed," Porat said in her ear. "Can you detain him?" "I think so." She watched and waited for a long minute. The human walked through the crowd, looking for the blue head of his partner, who was now slumped unconscious on the side of the street. Sari edged closer, and when she saw the human stagger from the drug, she rushed him from the side. "It's okay, sir," she said. "I've got you." What the human moaned, "Was it you?" "A little early for so much ale, sir," she said, loud enough to be heard as she maneuvered the man into a side alley next to the outhouse. She barely got him off the street before his legs totally gave out under him. "Ah, Stang," the man groaned as she pushed him against the wall. "Can't feel my legs, my arms." "Who are you working for?" she asked as she pinned both his shoulders to the ferrocrete. The man blinked fiercely. "None of your carking business." "I think it is." She edged the hood of her cloak back to reveal some of her face and the blue leathorns that draped over her shoulders. Even drugged, the man's eyes widened in recognition. We thought you were at the ship. Chalk's agents would never be as sloppy as you and your friend. You're bounty hunters, aren't you?" The man made a growling noise in the back of his throat, which was all the confirmation she needed. A shadow fell over them both, and Sari looked up to see Porat leaning over them. He crouched down beside her and put a flat hand against the human's chest. "Amateurs," she told him. "We got lucky." "Not so lucky," Porat said darkly. "How did you know to look for us here?" The man blinked furiously as he struggled to stay away. Porat slapped his cheek, not too hard, and asked, "Are there more than two of you? Is anyone waiting for us at the spaceport?" The man's lips trembled. Breath puffed between them. Finally, he said, "Should've, never taken, job." Finally, his head rolled to one side and slumped forward. He was out. They'd gotten nothing useful from him. Now what? Sari asked. Now we get to the port and get off this planet. And him. She looked at the pathetic face of the one who would have handed them over to their enemies. Her hand went into her cloak and found the blaster hidden there. Let him be? We'll be long gone by the time he wakes up. Mercy was not a trait she'd been raised with. She'd learned it late, and she'd learned it from Porat. Her father, the last Darth Wyerlock, would have scorned her for what she was doing now. But her father was dead, and so was the force that had given him his dark power. It was a brand new galaxy, by her counts neither better nor worse than what had become before, but the rules were different. She was different. Sari released her blaster and stood up. Porat did too. Let's get out of here, she said. They hurried together out of the alley and into the street. Sari dipped back once again to watch her husband's back for tailors, but they seemed to be clear this time. They ran into no problems in the spaceport, and 15 minutes after leaving the alley, their spacecraft, a compact civilian model Income Scout, kicked off from Racopia's surface and climbed through its atmosphere. Where do we go now? Sari asked as they shuddered through escape velocity. Hands tight on the control yoke, Porat said. We need to get further from the core. Champala. The Chagrian homeworld was about the only place their kind wouldn't stand out. Porat shook his head. Chalk will be watching there. After they escaped the atmosphere and sailed through Racopia's lower orbit, he brought up the nav computer. I was thinking Afrin IV. She frowned. What's on Afrin IV? Not much, except for one person. Samin Douglas. Should that be familiar to me? No, but her husband Tanter was with my unit during the war. He looked at her deliberately. Tanter is still stationed on the Alliance. She understood now, and should have from the start. You want to meet up with Admiral Bay's fleet? Yes. Samin's a civilian, but I know Tanter taught her a few tricks for covert communications. She should know a way to contact her husband, wherever he is, and I don't think Chalk's people will be watching her. Not on Afrin IV. Are you sure that's safe? It's where we belong. He said it with such conviction. She'd been a fool to think her husband would ever lay low and prioritize his own safety during a time of crisis. It was his earnest devotion to the Alliance and his principles that had drawn her to him at the start, though not in the way it did now. After the murder of her father, the death of Darth Krayt, and the defeat of the one Sith, Sari had been alone in the galaxy, with no strength to draw on except the dark side of the Force. She'd fallen in with a group of Chagrian's refugees because it was the best place to be anonymous, and it was from then that she'd first heard about Porat Darrell, an infantry commander under Admiral Stasi who aimed to turn his war hero cloud into a political career, with the then hypothetical Federation Senate. For all that, and his activity in refugee relief operations, he was already a local celebrity on Champala. Because grief and the dark side had clouded her mind in those days, she'd been looking for opportunities for revenge, and Porat had presented a unique one. In seducing him, she thought she could rise by his side and subtly enact her vengeance against the scattered one Sith and Empress Fel. She was young and attractive. He was ambitious. She thought they could use each other well. Things had started going awry even before Darth Maladi's plague swept the galaxy. To her surprise, Porat had demonstrated not just political cunning but a genuine Alliance patriotism, a commitment to freedom and democracy, and all those other lofty abstractions Sith always sneered at. At first she sneered at him too, behind his back, but as time went on she saw that his idealism in no way negated his intelligence. Instead, it propelled him to greater heights. She started having doubts and felt ashamed of them. And then the Force had disappeared. To the vast majority of the galaxy, the sudden silence in the Force was a scrap on the news nets and nothing more. To her it had upended everything. All the convictions she clung to, all the emotions that had empowered her, evaporated like dew under hot sun. Freed from the shackles of the Force, she finally admitted to herself that she'd fallen in love with her husband. and, after a month of manic self-doubt, she'd admitted to Porat what she was. She told him all of it, fully expecting him to throw her to the authorities, but he hadn't. He stood with her when all the galaxy seemed arrayed against her. If we do make contact with the Lions, Porat told her now, as they sat temporarily safe in his shuttle's cockpit. You don't have to come with me. I can join Bay, and you can stay with Samine. We're safe. No, she shook her head and took his hand. We're in this together. Always. Porat nodded. She could see the affection in his eyes, and the pride. He stood with her, so she'd stay with him. Love bred power like the Sith had never known. In losing the Force, Sari had gained more than she'd ever thought possible. Chapter 2. There were two suns shining faint in Rahikala's sky, one blue, the other white. Together, they cast the planet's surface in a strange double light, one that reminded Cade Skywalker of nothing more than the spectral gleam of a Force ghost. It did nothing to soothe his nerves, but it felt appropriate given what this planet was and what it meant, which he was only now beginning to understand. The standoff which Cade, his allies, and his reluctant partners had wandered into had thankfully dissipated. When they got in close to the ancient alien hypergate, that towering stone arch that promised instant passage to the heart of the galaxy, Yuuzhan Vong had emerged from the surrounding cliff walls, trapped them under threat of violence. Then their captors had been joined by one more Yuuzhan Vong, familiar to Cade yet changed, and a small group of robed aliens belonging to no species he had ever seen. Once Cade had explained who he was and what he'd wanted, Khat Lah had ordered his Yuuzhan Vong warriors to stand down. The blue-skinned, Saurian aliens had likewise relaxed their guard and even offered help. Right now one of them was aboard Cade's Mynock, perched on the cliff edge above, lending some arcane force-based healing powers to Imperial Knight Jao Assam, who'd taken a very nasty lightsaber wound to the gut. Even as he stood in the shadow of the arch with Khat Lah, Cade kept glancing back at the ones responsible. These Yuuzhan Vong had relaxed their guard around Mynock's crew, but they remained close to the two Sith who'd become entangled with Cade's quest on Tython. Darth Talon kept watching Cade like he watched her, with constant suspicion. He figured they had less to worry about with Eli Horn. The teenage apprentice, bereft of the scarlet and black tattoos of his master, looked lost and helpless like a panther cub without his parent. Of course, Eli was the one who nearly killed Jao, so it was good to keep an eye on him. Khat Lah was eyeing the Sith too. I'm surprised you've brought them with you, the Yuuzhan Vong said. That wasn't part of the plan, Cade told him as they stood beneath the towering, empty arch. They're more like hangers-on, but I've got them under control. The young human, what is his name? No sense hiding it. Eli Horn, you knew his dad, right? Khat Lah's eyes bore into the distance. Yes. I owe him everything. I figured that. You were using his name while you were running around the galaxy, trying to fix up this thing. Did you have any idea the kind of crowd his son fell in with? No. It never occurred to me, the Yuuzhan Vong trailed off. His face was hard to read, but in the Force Khat Lah's emotion was clear. He was feeling guilty. The kid made his own choice, Cade said. And, hell, everybody makes mistakes. He'd done his own spell in company of the Sith. He snapped out of it faster than the Horn kid, though. Still, said Khat Lah, I made a promise to his father. To the memory of Riker Horn. I get it. I do. Cade examined that face. It had the features typical of Yuuzhan Vong's sloping forehead, thin lips, flat nostrils, but it lacked the tattoos or scarring the surrounding warriors bore. Cade vaguely remembered that Khat Lah had belonged to the Ganner sect, a group of warriors who'd idolized the Jedi. Well, Khat Lah seemed to have surpassed his idols now. The Yuuzhan Vong had gained connection with the Force a decade ago, during the Sith Imperial War. Cade still wasn't sure how it worked, but it seemed to have had something to do with the fact that Khat Lah had been with Cade's grandmother, Cade Skywalker, when she died. Cade remembered her as a small, gentle woman, but she'd had immense native Force power, and in her dying moments she'd become a blazing nova felt across the galaxy. As he felt the Yuuzhan Vong's force, or now he picked up something that faintly recalled his grandmother's. It was like a memory of a memory. What really bothered him about Khat Lah, though, was the fact that he looked around a decade older than he should have. Cade had last seen him a decade ago, and not for very long, but he'd been a tall, strong warrior in his prime. He still looked big and tough enough to win any fight, but his face had grown leathery, and his long hair was more gray than black. Cade had never been one to beat around any bush, so he came out and asked it. "The years don't look to have been very nice to you," he told Khat Lah. "Or is there some other reason you so much older than the last time we met?" The Yuuzhan Vong lifted his eyes to the tall arch. "Time is different on the other side of the gate." "You mean faster?" A moment passed. Then he said, "Usually." Cade hadn't spent a year chasing phantoms across the galaxy to settle for cryptic answers. "What's on the other side of the gate? What exactly? And why did you put so much damn effort in getting there?" "You said you spoke with Tasha Rio." "I wouldn't say spoke with, but yeah, we talked." It had been more like some surreal melding of minds. When Cade had stepped inside the Thoyur, that ancient pyramid vessel half buried in a Tython snowfield, he'd made contact with the consciousness of an ancient Twi'lek Jedi, held within the Thoyur for eons. She'd been the one to show him the way to Rahikala, as she had to Khat Lah before him. That still didn't mean he understood any of it. His experience inside the Thoyur was like a fever dream, and his memories were fading every minute. "The hypergate leads to a place of immense force power," Khat Lah said. "A world located so close to the center of the galaxy that it is unreachable by starship." Cade gave another look around the canyon floor. Everyone he could see, he could feel in the force. That went for the Sith, his friends Jeriah and Delia, even the Yuuzhan Vong warriors, which should have been impossible. Of course, Khat Lah should have been impossible too. "This world," he said, "can it give anyone a connection with the Force?" "Yes, I believe so." Cade glanced at the Sith again. "Well, we've got some people who'd love to go through and get their powers reactivated. And a lot more around the galaxy." "It is not that simple," Khat Lah hissed. "You have no idea of the power of that place." "Then explain it to me. You've clearly spent a lot of time there." Khat Lah seemed to hesitate. Cade was about to press when a prissy mechanical voice sounded behind him. "Good news, Master Cade. Master Jo's serious injuries have been taken care of. He is now resting comfortably aboard Mynock and should be fully operational within a standard day." Cade and Khat Lah both turned to CC-3PO shuffling toward them. Rahikala's cold double glow took the warmth off his golden plates, but brought out the colors on the blue and white astromech rolling beside him. R2-D2 gave a happy tweet, agreeing with the protocol droid's statement. That was a relief, but Cade was more interested to talk to the ones coming in behind the droids. The towering Wookiee Lobaka was a master a century and a half old, as knowledgeable as any Jedi when it came to the Force, but he guessed the robed, blue-skinned alien walking beside him would know even more. He just hoped they'd come out anyway, and instead of being evasive and cryptic. He'd had enough of that. "Your machine is correct," the alien said in slow, accented basic. "A day is all your friend should require before being fully healed." "Thanks for your help," Cade said. "It means a lot." "It was a Yevik who healed him. I am Elorum." The alien reached up with 3 clawed hands and pulled the hood of his robe. The revealed face had reptilian eyes with vertical slits, forward facing on a short-snouted face. A long, thick neck connected head to shoulders, and though the rest of the body was hidden in robes, Cade could tell from their movements that they walked on long-boned, reverse-articulated legs. "I'd like to hear what you guys are all about," said Cade. "How long you've been watching over that hypergate, and why?" "I already told you, Skywalker," said Khat Lah. "They have been protecting it for eons, since before our civilizations existed." "You speak pretty good basic for somebody who's been in hiding for 50,000 years, Cade told Elorum. "Most of our kind cannot. I am an interlocutor. From time to time, outsiders have found this place and come to us seeking wisdom." Cade crossed his arms. "When was the last time you got a visitor?" "A Jedi Master came to us." Elorum's eyes narrowed. nearly 200 of your years ago. Cade exhaled, and Lobaka gave a low moan. He translated, "Don't suppose it was a big furry guy with tusks. It was a human. Then it wasn't anybody we know." Cade gestured to the gate. "Seriously, this gate's been out of service for what, 1,000 years?" "Far longer than that," said Elorum. "And you've been babysitting broke-down hardware for all that time." "We are the keepers of the Whills," the alien said with utmost dignity. "Protecting this place is our only purpose. Its power cannot be allowed to fall into the wrong hands." "And what is a will exactly?" "I've heard that before. From Tasha Rio inside the Lawyer. A will is a being that has become one with the Force and guides its flow." "You mean they died?" "No. Their connection with the Force was so strong that they dissolved their mortal bodies willingly. It is skill that has been lost for millennia, but was mastered by the beings you call Celestials. Their wills remain as a guiding hand that touches the living Force. And they're on the other side of the gate." Elorum and Khat Lah exchanged looks. The Yuuzhan Vong said, "The Whills are nowhere. They have no physical bodies, no location. But you're their keepers. How do you keep something that doesn't exist?" Cade was starting to feel like a kid left behind in class. He asked Lobaka, "Do you have any idea what the cart they're on about?" The Wookiee gave a frustrated roar and shook his head. "Through the gate is what they left behind," said Elorum. "Their power still echoes in that place." "So what? They used to live there?" Elorum and Khat Lah shared looks again. Khat Lah asked, "You've been to Zanima Second, haven't you?" "A couple times. As a kid." "Did you ever speak with Sekhet itself?" The consciousness which governed the planet was said to appear as a specter that looked as lifelike as any real being. According to his father, who'd grown up on Zanima and spoke with Sekhet several times, the planet liked to manifest itself in the forms of Jedi it had met in the past. A child version of Anakin Skywalker was apparently his favorite, and Cade was glad not to have to look into a young Vader's eyes. "I never met it," he admitted. "What does Zanima Second have to do with this place? Have you ever wondered why, in all the galaxy, there is only one planet on which a singular collective awareness has arisen from the Force?" He hadn't, not really. Zanima Second had been a fascination of his father, but it had never been a big part of his life. He'd had plenty other problems to grapple with. "I don't know," Cade admitted. "I never gave it much thought." Lobaka gave a series of grunts and growls, and C-3PO said, "Master Lobaka suggests that Zanima Second is unique, given its extragalactic origin and the fact that it was apparently a seat of the original Yuuzhan Vong homeworld." "Zanima is special," Khat Lah agreed, but that never answered the question. Why did no planets native to this galaxy develop a consciousness? "We give up." Cade spread his arms. "Why?" The answer is simple. They did. Cade found his eyes drawn toward the gate. "And one of those is on the other side." "No," said Elorum. "On the other side is the world left behind when the planetary consciousness became so powerful it could ascend to join the cosmic force and become a will. The transformation was so great that sparks of its essence linger there. Still. It is not the only such world to find consciousness," Khat Lah added. "Many planets the Jedi consider for strong were on the path to attaining it. Titan was close, but the world was ravished by the schism in the Jedi Order." "The one that made those guys?" Cade threw a glare at the Sith. Khat Lah nodded. It was a lot to take in. It made Cade feel small and confused and powerless, and way out of his depth. He hated that feeling, even though he should have been used to it by now. Lobaka roared, and C-3PO said, "We would like to see what lies beyond the gate ourselves." "I understand the desire to regain the Force," said Khat Lah. "But the other side of the gate is dangerous in ways you can't understand." "We'll understand if you take us," Cade said. They still looked hesitant, and he asked, "When you took your Yuuzhan Vong buddies to the other side of the gate, did you know what would happen to them?" "I did not, and it has taken them a long time to learn to control their power. Some," he added darkly, "did not survive." "It was that kind of danger, then?" Of course it would be. To Cade's surprise, Elorum said, I believe a Skywalker would be able to handle the risks. What do you know about Skywalkers? Those reptilian eyes looked at him, just looked, but Elorum said nothing. Lobacca roared and Cade said, he's right. Lobacca used to be Grand Master of the Grand Jedi Order. If you can trust anybody on the other side of the gate, it's this guy. Way more than me. The way they were talking about it, he wasn't sure he wanted to go through. We must speak with the other keepers to decide who may be allowed through, Elorum said. Until then, we will guard the gate against all trespassers. He lifted a clawed hand toward the Sith. Especially them? You'll get no argument from me there, Cade breathed. But you've got to understand, outside of this planet there's only a couple people in the whole galaxy that can use the Force. Hundreds of Jedi and Imperial Knights, plus tons of other Force user schools, they're all gonna want a piece of this. That is why it must be guarded, said Elorum said with gravity. At that moment Cade finally understood a little about these keepers of the Whills. For thousands of years and thousands of generations they must have stood watch on this lonely, forgotten world, watching the lonely, forgotten gate that didn't even work, all on the belief that one day some of them would be called to protect it. Now that day had finally come. This was their time to fulfill their destinies, the legacy they'd inherited. He couldn't blame them for taking their job seriously. Lobacca, always quicker on the uptake, growled respectfully, and C-3PO translated, we of course understand that you must take your time and deliberate. We will be happy to grant any assistance as you make your decision. R2-D2 whistled affirmative and rocked on his two legs. Elorum said, it has been nearly 2 centuries since we received Jedi visitors. Khat Lah has explained to us much of what has passed. But my perspective is different from yours, and limited, the Yuuzhan Vong allowed. Lobacca roared, and C-3PO said, Master Lobacca experienced firsthand much of the drama that had affected the galaxy for the past century and a half. He would be happy to tell you his tale. I, of course, would be on hand to translate. The droid's photoreceptors flickered slightly as he focused on Elorum. If I may presume, are you not a member of species known in our records as the Qua? The Saurian dipped his head in a nod. You call us that? Oh my, how exciting. C-3PO said with sudden verve. Why, the common consensus among modern scholars is that your kind is extinct. Some researchers trace a connection between your race and the Blue Mountain people on Dathomir, but that is considered speculative by most in the field. I believe there have also been attempts to link your civilization to the lost ruins on Talon and Van Dyne, and even Dantooine, though the last example is considered far-fetched by all but the most French scholars. In fact, according to my databanks. 3PO, K said, but the droid changed tack instead of slowing down. Did you know, after nearly 2 centuries of service I had my first opportunity to converse with a member of the Gree race, just a year ago. As I'm sure you know, their civilization is just as ancient as yours, and marginally more extant. The version of their language included in my translation database proved quite helpful in the task. 3PO, K sighed, then had an idea. I don't suppose you've got any Quan Yu, do you? My database does in fact contain material on the Qua language as partially reconstructed by xenoarchaeologists working in the Quilii sector. The droid turned to face Elorum and released a series of very alien-sounding hisses from his vocoder. The Qua slit pupils widened in surprise, the first real emotion Cade had seen him show. He opened his mouth and gave his own series of hisses, to which C-3PO replied with some more. Oh, thank the maker. The droid warbled, my translation database is more thorough than I'd ever imagined. Beside him, R2-D2 chirped happily. Watching them, an idea came to Cade that should have been obvious. Placing a hand on R2's dome, he looked to Elorum and said, you want somebody to tell you a story. You're not gonna find better witnesses than these two. Chapter 3. It seemed faintly inappropriate to hold the memorial ceremony for Marasiah Fel inside a sporting arena, but it was the largest gathering place in Galactic City, and the Empress deserved as grand a crowd as could be mustered. A holo image of her head and shoulders, blown up to the size of a small frigate, hovered over the great bowl, looking beautiful and stern. On the central floor, scarlet-armored Imperial knights stood in perfect order and faced the raised dais on which a closed coffin had been placed. Also on the floor were dignitaries of every kind. Jedi knights wore dowdy robes, while the Happen delegation was dressed in the finest shimmer silks. Imperial admirals stood alongside ones in alliance uniforms. Senators of all political affiliations were mixed together wearing expressions of grave respect. As he watched the crowd from the ranks of Imperial knights, Treeson thought bitterly how a smaller but similar show of solidarity had been staged just weeks before, after the murder of Antares Draco. The very next day the political fighting had resumed, as vicious as ever. He doubted they'd respect Marasiah's memory any more than her husband's. Still, everyone held solemn attention as Hogrum came to the center of the stage. His black robes, scarred face, and cybernetic eyepiece gave him a fearsome countenance, and supposedly pro-alliance radicals were drawing quick comparisons to the legendary Darth Vader, but when he spoke his voice creaked with a very human grief. "It is my sad duty to consign Empress Marasiah Fel, my niece, to rest this day," Chalk said. Since childhood, Marasiah knew that rulership was neither an honor nor a privilege. It is a responsibility, and a grave one. To shoulder the weight of the galaxy is no easy task, but the Fel monarchs have given their lives wholly to the cause, again and again. It was bitter truth. Trees had seen more than his share of monarchs put to rest. The cremation of Roan Fel was still fresh in his memory. Performed in the aftermath of the reconquest of Coruscant, while half the planet still smoldered from the fighting, it had been a private and solemn affair attended by select officials, Imperial knights, and Jedi Master. Hogrum Chalk had spoken in praise of his brother-in-law's selflessness and honor, and only a handful had known those words were a lie. The ceremony for Marasiah Fel was more like her grandfather's. Trees had been a mere teenager when he gathered with the other new knights on the arena stage, and watched along with gathered thousands as Emperor Davik Fel's body was put to pyre alongside that of his son Vitor. That was over 40 years ago. Right now it felt like even longer. Since Jagged Fel himself, their line has given everything in service to peace, security, and prosperity for all galactic citizens, Chalk continued. Marasiah knew she might one day pay the final price, and she was prepared for it. The great tragedy today is twofold. One is that a woman so young should lose her life and leave no heirs to carry on her legacy. The second is that she already lost so much before her sacrifice. Just weeks ago, her beloved husband Antares was killed. 3 years ago, her father was felled by a Sith assassin, and as a teenager a traitor slew her mother, my sister Ellie. Chalk took a breath. We can only pray that a third layer of tragedy will not be added to her death. To honor Marasiah, we must honor the system of law and order she gave her life to build. We must uphold the system she created and punish those who would seek to destroy it. Anything else would be a tragedy and a betrayal. Trees wondered how political this would get. The Imperial and Alliance senators alike kept their expressions admirably stiff. You may ask yourselves, why? Why did Marasiah and her predecessors willingly give so much, when so little was given to them in return? It's because someone must. They understood that and were willing to take on the suffering for the sake of us all. It's with a heavy heart that I take on that responsibility now. As regent, I will honor the galaxy the Fel family has died to create, no matter its cost to me. I do this out of love for my niece, for my sister long dead, and for all members of the Fel dynasty. Their light has finally gone out, and the galaxy is a much darker place for it. Tonight we will light one last blaze in their honor, and grant Marasiah the honor she deserves. That was the signal. Hogrum stepped back from the stage's edge, and Trees joined 5 other senior knights in stepping from the ranks and approaching the closed coffin. They surrounded his dais, took rehearsed positions, then solemnly ignited 6 pure white lightsaber blades. They'd rehearsed it, but Tree still felt something swell in his chest as he and the other knights held out the blades. Hot white light touched 6 fuses at corners of the dais. Fuses burst to flame and 6 fire-hot lines raced from the edge of the platform and converged on the coffin itself. Solemnly, ceremoniously, the knights shut down their lightsabers, turned their backs on the coffin, and walked back to the lines of their comrades. When Trees turned to face the coffin again, it was fully ablaze. As he watched the flames climb toward the night sky and listened to a solemn version of the Federation anthem, all the past memorials rolled through his mind. It was as though this ceremony was the convergence of all the others he'd attended, Davex and Viders, Elias, Romes, Dracos, and now Marasiah's. He never felt so old. And yet, those flames might not have been hers. Investigators had rushed the Empress bombed apartment as soon as they could douse the fire. The body inside had been burned beyond recognition, but genetic testing had apparently confirmed it as Marasiah's. He'd spoken to the Empress just hours before and knew she'd planned to be in her quarters that evening. He'd have never doubted her death except for the call he'd gotten shortly after the bombing. Ganner Krieg and Aslan Ray had explained nothing. They'd only told him that Marasiah was alive and Hogrum was a liar. He had no idea what had become of them since. Trees was trapped in strange limbo, unable to grieve properly or trust anyone. If Hogrum Chalk Marasiah's uncle, Rome's brother-in-law, couldn't be trusted, who could be? And yet, Trees thought as he watched the flames, Hogrum had been a very convincing liar at Rome's funeral. More lies were possible, but he shirked from it. That kind of treason would be on par with Eshker 9, and Hogrum would never stoop to the level of the man who's murdered his sister. Trees refused to believe it. And yet, something felt wrong about all of this. The Force didn't tell him that, only his gut. After a lifetime of trust in the whispers of the universe's invisible flow, he was starting to question how often those whispers had truly been the Force, and how often he'd been hearing what he wanted to hear. Many of the younger knights confessed that fear to him, and as their senior he'd given them his best hollow comforts. If only someone would comfort him. There were no more speeches after the fire burned out. Alliance and Imperial dignitaries removed themselves peacefully from the main floor, while the civilians crowded in the arena stands filed out by the thousands. The Imperial Knights were the last to leave, once the final smoke wisps had left the Empress pyre. It had been a long ceremony, and Trees was an old man. He was tired and wanted nothing more than the peace of sleep, but as he removed his armored plates after returning to the palace complex, there was a knock on his door. Trees allowed one heavy sigh, then opened it. He was surprised to see a slim blue-skinned Twi'lek woman looking up at him. From her eyes he could tell she had been crying during the ceremony. "Good evening, Master Sende," Astral Veil said. "I hope you're well." She seemed stiff, on guard, and slightly confused. So was Trees. "Good evening, Mistress Veil. Can I help you with something?" "Regent Chalk has requested your presence." Astral had been Marasiah's friend and confidant, and she'd been a natural fit for the Empress' personal aide. It seemed much stranger for her to be running errands for Hogrum Chalk. "All right. I'll be in his office shortly." "Not his office, sir. His personal quarters." "I see." Sin blinked, then added, "I'm afraid I don't know the way." "I can't take you, sir." "All right. Give me a minute." Trees needed 3 to fully change into more comfortable clothes. He wasn't as quick as he used to be. As he followed Astral through the night-empty corridors of the palace, he tried to recall if he'd ever been in Hogrum's personal quarters in all the years he'd known him. He'd always been a private person, truly open to no one except his older sister. After Elia's murder, a wall had seemed to fall between him and the other Imperial Knights. Astral let him enter Hogrum's quarters alone. He'd expected something bleak and cold, and fitting with the man's black robes and half-mechanical face, and was surprised to find it decorated in a slightly antique-happened style. Elegant two-dimensional artwork hung on the walls next to tall cases full of data cards. Warm tinted light fixtures were placed in corners and turned low to simulate hearth and fires. Hogrum himself, still in the metal casing he needed to survive, looked slightly incongruous in such a place. "Thank you for coming, Master Sende." Hogrum took Tree's hand and shook it once. "Sit down, please. I won't keep you long, but there are things we should talk about." "Of course," Tree said politely. He followed Hogrum into the living room and sat down in a low, soft chair facing the regents. Galactic City's skyline lit up beyond the window. Nestled against the frame was a waist-high table, its top bare except for a single lightsaber held horizontally in an elegant holder. Hogrum noticed his gaze. It was Elias. "Ah," said Treese. Nothing else came to mind. The regent sighed. "I've been thinking lately about the day we first met. I'm sure you remember it." Of course he did. The Sith and their allies had been attacking the last redoubt of Happen loyalists in the Orlan system. Their station, half submerged in the swirls of a gas giant, had been doomed, but Treese and Roan, with Nat Skywalker alongside, had charged into a flooding chamber to evacuate the nobles onto a starship flown by Roan's uncle. Hogrum and Elia had been two of the last ones aboard. The brother had been just a boy then, the sister a teenager the same age as Roan and Treese. He recalled the Chalk siblings' utter ignorance of what had been going on outside their own corner of space, and Roan had been both affronted and intrigued by the girl who failed to recognize him as an imperial prince. Even that early, Treese had known his friend was falling in love. "That was a long time ago," Treese said before he let memory swallow him. All of them were dead now except he and Hogrum, two old men. It was. Hogrum looked away from the lightsaber. Things were simpler then, in their way. Things always seem simpler in retrospect, Treese thought. "What did you want to talk about?" Hogrum settled into his chair. "Several things. I want you to know that I intend to keep using the Imperial Knights as best as they're able, and not just as ceremonial props." "I'm glad to hear that. I'll need your help, Master Sende, and I need your assurances. The Imperial Knight swore to obey the reigning Fel monarch. The Fel line is dead, but I represent the same authority. I'll need their loyalty as much as Saya or Roan did." "I understand, though I should point out that the Imperial Knights were created to serve our monarch, as long as he or she acts on the light side of the Force." Treese didn't at what they'd done to Roan Fel once he strayed to the dark. It didn't need to be said aloud. "I understand," Hogrum said. "When Saya was alive, she could act as the Force commanded her. I cannot, and neither can anyone else except Cade Skywalker." Treese resisted a frown. He grudgingly admitted there were admirable traits in the rogue Skywalker, but he'd never be rulership material. "It's a difficult situation, but I don't want the Knights to be disbanded or turned to stage props." "I agree, and that's why I'll need you to guide our Knights through what lies ahead. I have important roles planned. For a start, I'm going to spend the next several days meeting with the Happens while they're on Coruscant. If we can work closer ties between the Federation and the Happen Republic, it will solidify both our governments. I'd like you to select Knights to handle all security for those meetings." "Of course." Hogrum rattled off a list of further duties he needed Treese to assign Knights to. Most were located in Galactic City and involved providing security to important state functions. There was nothing wrong with that, but Treese felt dull disappointment. They'd done greater work once. When Hogrum seemed done, he asked, "Sir, what about the investigation into Saya's death?" "I have my intelligence people handling that." "I know. You can understand, sir, that all of the Knights want a hand in bringing her killers to justice." "I do understand, but I'll be blunt. I need our best investigators to make the case in public trial. Our Knights are fine warriors, but they're not detectives. Saya sent 2 Knights halfway across the galaxy to find Draco's killers. They barely came back in one piece and totally failed to get hard evidence." Treese knew which Knights he was talking about. "I see. That brings me to another point," Hogrum said. "I'd like you to personally make inquiries among your Knights. If any of them have even the slightest idea what's become of Krieg and Rey, I need to know." "I assure you, we've had no contact from them," Treese lied instinctively. "Their disappearance and the timing of it is very distressing." His tone was dark. Treese leaned forward. "I'm sorry. Are you suggesting that they had anything to do with it?" "It has to be considered. Aslan Rey's loyalties have always wavering." "I know, sir, but she'd never murder the Empress. And Master Krieg. Krieg tried to kill himself out of guilt for spreading the virus," Hogrum said coolly. "Later on, his best friend died in his arms. None of that gives him any reason to kill Saya. For Antares' sake, if nothing else, he'd. There's no way to tell for sure what a man who's been through Krieg's mental trauma will do. I don't like this any more than you, but they have to be considered persons of interest in Sia's death. I've avoided making a public announcement about them, because I don't want to tarnish the knight's image with unwarranted accusations, but something must be done to find them. There are ways for Imperial Knights to reach out in emergencies. Encrypted frequencies which Hogrum surely knew and likely monitored. Treese had thought of those already. Don't attempt to make contact yet, Hogrum said, though if they do attempt to contact themselves, I want every word they say recorded. You don't trust them? We can't afford to trust anyone. It was truer than even Hogrum knew. So I'll ask around and wait to be contacted. That's right. If the time comes for more aggressive action, we'll decide on it together. Of course, Treese said, together. The words were good enough, and the private room, dark and soft with nostalgia, offered a glimpse into Hogrum Chalk he hadn't expected to see. Yet despite that, Treese felt discomfited as he returned to his room. It occurred to him that, for all his talk of utilizing the Imperial Knights, he was making them into little more than a glorified security team for the Regent. In fairness, losing the Force had robbed them of many old abilities, but Treese believed his knights were still capable of more. The conversation about Ganner and Aslan was more disturbing. He didn't fault Hogrum for being suspicious, even paranoid, but he couldn't believe the two young knights could be complicit in acting against the Empress. But then, he couldn't believe it of Hogrum either. He'd made inquiries into Ganner and Aslan. What he reported to Hogrum would depend on what he'd find. As he reached his room, Treese reflected wearily that in this new galaxy anything was possible. Now more than ever he craved certainty from the Force. Sound sleep was a luxury of the young. As Treese lay down in darkness, he resigned himself to a long night of questions, asked and unanswered. Time had little meaning for Marasiah Fel. The gradual brightening and diminishing of overhead lights simulated day and night, but she had no way of knowing how well they matched reality except for the natural rhythms of her body, themselves unreliable. Worse still, she had no force to draw on for wisdom, guidance, or strength. Sometimes, when the lights turned off and she was dropped into full dark, she felt like she was already dead. But she was only imprisoned. It was capacious as far as jail cells went, a completely circular chamber with a soft sofa and softer chair, a bed, a refresher alcove, and 2 tables. A portal in the wall dispensed 2 meals a day and, every fake morning, a new set of clothes, always the same loose white shirt and trousers. The walls themselves brightened in similitude of day. She'd explored every inch of room and could not find a corner in which the Force could be felt. Likely her uncle had placed 2, maybe 3 isolameri around the room, completely enclosing it in a Force-splendid bubble. The worst part was that she didn't even know what the Force could do for her if she had it. She was somewhere deep in the underlevels of Coruscant, likely beneath the palace complex itself. Likely multiple layers of security first automated, then man stood between her and any hint of freedom. Even if she did break out of this place, she had no idea where she could go. The Force would avail her little, but then, the Force had disappointed of late. It hadn't warned her of her uncle's betrayal, and it hadn't saved her husband's life. It hadn't provided wisdom or guidance when she needed it. At most, it had propped her up with the strength to walk into her uncle's trap. During those death times of total black, she felt glad the Force was gone. Marasiah was starting to lose track of night and day cycles when her uncle finally came to see her. The walls were bright white when he entered through a door she'd only noticed on repeated inspection. The panel slid into the luminous wall, and Hogrum was there, draped in black, like a singularity not even the room's brightness could touch. The door shut and locked behind him as he stepped inside, the hem of his cape trailing black on the clean white floor. Marasiah stood in the middle of the room, hands clenched at her sides, wondering if she should attack him now. Wondering how much hurt she could deal before the room's unseen security shot her down. You should know that your memorial service was held today. It was quite a spectacle. Hogrum's voice was as unreadable as his scarred, half-metal face. All the senior Alliance senators showed up to pay respect. though still active at any rate. What have you done? What was necessary to preserve the Galactic Federation? He sounded like he believed it, but she couldn't be sure of anything. She'd known this man all her life, trained under him, loved him and grieved with him when her mother had died. For the first time, he was a stranger to her. You were unwilling to take action against elements that would tear the Federation apart and plunge us into yet another war, Hagram said. However, your tragic death has given me the liberty to purge those elements. She snorted. You've arrested every Alliance senator. No, only Kaiga and Nellerin. Admiral Stasi naturally had to be apprehended. After a pause, he added, Senator Darrell escaped somehow, but he'll be detained in time. Stasi had nothing to do with Antares' death. And the others. Stasi is an uncontrollable element. Darth Krayt failed to bring him down, and it destroyed him. I didn't make that mistake. He paused again. Unfortunately, a small group of Alliance ships, led by Admiral Bay, have gone rogue. They disappeared from Bakura and haven't been seen since. Hands still clenched at her sides, she regarded him warily. Why are you telling me all this? You don't care what happens in the rest of the galaxy. Of course I care. I've spent my life fighting every way I can for peace and order. Yet as she said it, the words felt hollow somehow. Hagram, though, took them at face value. That's good. You're still your mother's daughter, Saya. From time to time, I'll stop by and discuss the state of affairs. Sometimes I may ask your advice. You can't be serious. You deposed me. You imprisoned me. She took a step forward. What I did was for your good, and that of the galaxy. His black draped shoulders shrugged. I don't expect you to believe that now, but in time you'll be able to look at the situation objectively. She threw out her hands at the chamber's bright walls. What do you plan to do? Keep me locked up here, alone, forever? As long as necessary, yes. Which may be quite some time. You can't believe I'll really give you advice. That I'll help you. I believe you're your mother's child more than your father's, which means you won't let personal spite overcome your desire for a peaceful galaxy. His words hit worse than any insult. If you think so highly of me, why did you depose me? Your intentions are noble, Saya, but your judgment became fatally clouded by personal issues. Your husband's death. Your desire not to become your father. You were ignoring vital threats to the Federation, and I did what I had to preserve it. My judgment wasn't clouded. Yours was, when you took off Eshkar-Nai's head. He didn't flinch. I took vengeance so you wouldn't have to. Don't lie me, uncle, she snarled. You enjoyed it. Didn't you? There was undeniable satisfaction. Nine had already served his purpose. He gave us proof of Darrell and Stasi's complicity. He gave you a grainy recording. It means nothing. It's proof of what we knew all along. What you wanted to be true. He flinched slightly. You assume the best in people too often, Saya. It's a virtue in most beings, but in a ruler it's a vice. I'm not in the mood for your cynical wisdom. She crossed her arms. You wanted power? You took it? Just admit it and don't try to act noble. He exhaled, a tiny sign of frustration. I don't take any joy in this. I saw the mistakes you were making and I did what I had to correct them. They were not mistakes. Yes, they were. I watched your father make mistakes too, year after year after year. I didn't even admit they were mistakes, not until Elia died. Even then I followed his orders, because he was my emperor. Hagram's lips formed a scowl. If I'd acted sooner, things would never have gotten as dire as they did. Well, you've acted now. The weight of the galaxy is on your shoulders. Don't expect me to help lift it off. I don't expect it now. But give it time. It won't be today or tomorrow, but your anger will get cold. You'll know what I did was right. And if I do, if I admit how brilliant and righteous you've been, will you let me go? She got the answer she expected. Her uncle said, Goodbye, Saya. We'll speak again. Then he turned with a swirl of black cape. The same portal appeared in the door, and Marasiah tried to peer through it, to get just a hint of the world outside her cage, but the room's bright lights obscured the outer dark. Hologram vanished into the black, and then the portal vanished with a slight of white. And then she was alone again, as alone as she'd ever been in her life. Her knees went weak, and she dropped into a crouch. This whole time she'd refrained from expressing her anger, sadness, or frustration. No tears, no shouts. She didn't want to give her unseen watchers the satisfaction, nor did she want her discipline to slip. She couldn't hold it in any longer. Marasiah screamed once, as long as she could, as loud as she could, until her throat scraped, and when she was done everything was the same. She was still trapped in her cage, alone with silence and light. Chapter 4. Eli Horn had anticipated a range of emotions he'd feel after finally finding Khat Lah and his mysterious hypergate: triumph, relief, awe, even fear. Boredom was the one thing he hadn't expected, but it was what he got. The Yuuzhan Vong treated the Sith as just short of prisoners. Even Skywalker's bunch were more accommodating. Eli and Talon were escorted by Empress-staff armed warriors wherever they went and were forbidden from climbing out of the canyon to access their ship. The warriors hadn't made a move to disarm them, and Eli had a feeling Talon might have risked fighting them, if not for the fact that they were blind to the Force and the Yuuzhan Vong were not. It was a stunning inversion of what used to be the order of things, and hardly the only one. Unfortunately, nobody was willing to answer their questions. They were given food and a place to rest in a cliffside cavern, but their Yuuzhan Vong warders never let their guard down. Eli was pretty sure they were under guard even while sleeping. The only amusement he got was watching the robed, blue-scaled Saurians gather around Skywalker's two droids. C-3PO and R2-D2 entertained them for hours at a time. C-3PO apparently spoke their native language, because Eli couldn't pick up a word, but he could tell the droids were narrating a story from C-3PO's broad gestures and the occasional sound effects that escaped his vocoder. One alien even seemed to be recording the words on a primitive parchment. What they were called, what they were doing here, how long they'd been here. Eli and Talon were free to wonder those things, but couldn't get any answers. And then, after days of storytelling and pointless discussion with no one passing through the gate, someone finally took notice of them. When Khat Lah approached, the guard stepped aside and respectfully backed out of earshot. The Yuuzhan Vong warrior, aged beyond Eli's understanding, looked at them both, and he knew in an instant that Khat Lah recognized him. Another unexpected emotion took Eli: shame. Talon, however, stood tall in front of the Yuuzhan Vong. She let one hand dangle near the lightsaber at her hip, just to remind it was there. "We've traveled as long and far as Skywalker to find you," she said. "We deserved a chance to speak to you sooner." Whether she was truly unbowed or just acting the part, Eli couldn't tell. Khat Lah, however, could. "You should know that my warriors will not allow anyone to pass through the gate without the permission of the keepers of the Whills. If you try, they will kill you." Talon didn't flinch. "What are these keepers? I've never seen one of their kind." Historians from this galaxy call their race the Qua. They have been guarding the hypergate for many millennia. They will not cease to protect it now. Skywalker said he could feel your warriors in the Force. Did the gate grant it to them? They gained it on the other side of the gate. And what is on the other side? Eli asked. Khat Lah let his eyes rest on the young man for the first time. A world you could never imagine, Eli Horn. He flinched at his own name. Talon, still firm, asked, "How will they decide who goes through the gate?" "It will not be you, Darth Talon," the Yuuzhan Vong said without taking eyes off the human. "Eli Horn, come with me." "Why?" "So we can speak in private." "Come." Eli placed a hand on his lightsaber. "Do you want me to disarm?" "Do what you like," the Yuuzhan Vong said, and stepped away. Eli looked at Talon, who responded with a stone-faced nod. Eli followed the Yuuzhan Vong past the guards, out of the cave, and onto the pathway carved from the cliffside ledge. It slanted down toward other caverns and the canyon floor. From here they were on level with the top of the hypergate arch, and looking down on the small figures below, he could appreciate the scale of the ancient construct. Eli tried to think about the hypergate, because it was easier than thinking of Khat Lah. After his father's death, the warrior had been a constant presence for nearly a year. Eli still remembered how he and two other Yuuzhan Vong had bravely defended the Jedi younglings during the first assault on the Jedi Temple, and how he'd repeated the feat with Cade during the frantic final attack at the war's end. Later, during the years in hiding, he'd understood that the tall, powerful, sometimes scary alien warrior was also an adept like him, not comfortable with the strange powers he'd been gifted but determined to explore them to the fullest. Empathy with Khat Lah hadn't prevented the warrior from being intimidating. Right now, Eli felt more cowed than ever in his presence. Khat Lah clasped hands at the small of his back and looked at the gate. "What do you think your father would see in you now, Eli Horn?" He'd been afraid the conversation would go here. "You stole his name when you went running around the galaxy. It took it as a show of respect. We'd both be dead without his sacrifice. I ask you again, what would he see in you?" Eli had no idea. His father had died when he was 5 years old, and he barely remembered the man. All he had left was lingering memory of a face and a force presence, but he didn't even need that to know the answer. "He wouldn't approve," Eli said curtly. "Why did you join the Sith?" "I was with a bunch of other apprentices, hiding out in a place that was supposed to be safe from Krait's hunters. The people there, our friends, were supposed to keep us safe." He swallowed hard. His heart still burned at the memory. "They betrayed us instead. They sold us out. The people the Jedi did everything to protect turned on us just like they turned on my father. So when the Sith said join us or die, what do you think I said?" His lip curled in a snarl. "It is a hard galaxy," Khat Lah said evenly. "Did you get what you wanted from the Sith?" "I did. I was gaining power and strength like the Jedi never had. But that's all gone now." "Yes. And if you had that power back, what would you do?" "I'd never be a victim. Never again." "That's not an answer. What would you do?" "Make yourself a Dark Lord." "I'll never be as powerful as Talon or Nil. I just want to be strong enough that I'll never be at anyone's mercy." "Not Talon's. Not Nil's." Eli's hands balled to fists. "What's the point of asking me this? I am trying to make a decision." "What kind of decision?" Instead of replying, Khat Lah looked up at the sky. Cloud drifts had dampened Rahakala's already weak suns, trapping the canyon in a deep blue twilight. Quietly he said, "Many among my people believe no lesson is truly learned until it has been purchased with pain." The words sounded vaguely familiar. They certainly rang true for Eli's life. "I have never embraced the pain like some warriors," he went on, "but there is wisdom in what they say. Do you agree?" "I've learned a lot of things from pain," Eli said gruffly. "So have I believed the Force did not connect with me until it had found me at my lowest, when I was so broken I could be reconstructed into something more than what I was." "Sounds like me when the Sith found me," Eli muttered. Khat Lah shook his head. "No. We are talking about two different things." "If you say so." "You don't understand. But perhaps you will." Eli felt a spike of anger. "I didn't chase you across the galaxy for a year just to be told I can't understand anything. And how did you expect me to act when I saw you again? When I saw what you become?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I never understood you." Khat Lah let the comment pass. Looking at the gate again, he said, "You should have known I, not you, would be in the position of power. Arrogance is a Sith trait you've learned too well." Eli hated being lectured, especially when it was true. "Is this what you took me aside to tell me?" "I wanted to see what had become of the young human I knew so many years ago." "How many years has it been for you?" "I've spent many on the other side of the gate." After a silence, Khat Lah asked, "How many have you killed as a Sith?" Eli blinked in surprise. "I don't know." "Think. Tell me." He took a breath, closed his eyes, thought. "There've been deaths in battle. A lightsaber slashed through a blaster and then through a chest, kill or be killed. There've been other deaths too, where the victim had been at his mercy." He remembered face but never names. Darth Talon had killed her beloved master on Krait's order, but Eli's murders had always been anonymous, impersonal. "How many?" Khat Lah repeated. Eli took a breath, made sure he had the right number, and said, 11. I've killed 11. I see. What does that have to do with anything? Did you feel powerful when you killed? Quietly, he said, yes. You do not sound proud of it. He had been proud, back when the Force had flowed through him, enriching him with the dark side's power. When he'd made others into victims, he felt a rush of certainty he'd never be one himself. Not anymore. That black and glorious feeling had disappeared with the Force. Now there was so much more uncertainty. If you received the Force again, would you still be Sith? Of course. Truly. I'll never be a Jedi. I'll never die like my father. He couldn't say it. Just the thought twisted him with anger and sadness. There are more fates than Jedi and Sith. The Force is bigger than you can possibly imagine, Eli Horn. I'll have to take your word for that, he said bitterly. Are we done here? Khat Lah looked at him. He looked away. With a hint of sadness, the Yuuzhan Vong said, yes, you may go inside. Eli was glad to turn away. 2 Yuuzhan Vong guards escorted him wordlessly back to the cave, where Darth Talon waited. She was, he thought with fresh spite, the closest to family he had left. The healers helped a lot, Jo said, but I don't feel ready to smash sabers with the Sith anytime soon. Kyra could tell that just from looking at him. He put on a new pair of clothes since getting help from one of the keepers of Whills Cade had called their species, but his face still looked pale, his eyes shrunken. She'd seen his bare abdomen, and it looked as though that lightsaber had never touched him, but the rest of Jo hadn't adapted to the miracle recovery. He walked a slow circle around Minix Crew long, flexing shoulders and twisting his spine, winced occasionally at real or phantom pain. To soothe him, Kyra said, from what I can tell, there's not much danger of the Sith making trouble. Those Yuuzhan Vong are keeping a close eye on them. Good. I think I'm ready to go down there and have a talk with those keepers. You can try, but right now I think they're all engaged in story time with the droids. She smirked, remembering the scene when she found C-3PO's battered, dirty head and Rugo Socorro scrap heap. She'd never imagined she was holding a living witness to almost 200 years of galactic history. She felt honored just to have recovered him. I don't understand why they won't just let us through the gate, Jo sighed. Skywalker and Lobaka say it's too dangerous. When I ask how it's dangerous, they just shrug and say they're getting a lot of vague, kinda menacing talk. She shrugged. I'm sure it would all go way over my head anyway. All of this is way past me. When they first sat down on Rahakala, Kyra had felt a surge of joy that she and Jo had survived capture by that Sith apprentice, Eli. Once that faded, she was left wondering what the hell she was doing here. Cade, Jo, Lobaka, and the Sith were all looking to get their precious Force powers back. Jeria and Delia had tagged along because of Cade, and she could tell they weren't very comfortable in this strange place. As for Kyra, she wasn't sure of her role at all. She'd only learned of her Force sensitivity days before losing it. Jo had taught her to touch his power briefly, and it had been a joyous revelation just when her world was already opening wide. When it had disappeared, she felt a painful lack and decided to chase it as far as she could. That had been a year ago, and she could no longer remember the feeling. Something had been taken from her. She grieved for it. Now a part of her felt ready to forget it and move on with her life. But on Rahakala, that didn't seem to be an option. We could try and contact Ania, Jo said as he continued to walk around the cabin, stretching. Something about the system really mucks up communications, apparently. We'd probably have to take Mynock for a couple light years jump. Then we'll ask Skywalker's permission. I doubt he'll say no. Do you want to call the other Imperial Knights and tell them what we found? I'm not technically an Imperial Knight myself, he reminded. And right now I don't want to do anything to upset our host. So this place stays secret for now. Even from Ania. We'll see if we can get in contact with her first, he said ambivalently. And before that, we need to get permission from Skywalker to use his ship. That sounds riskiest of all, she smiled. Do you want to try it? Sure, I could use a walk. He started for the exit with long, careful steps. Glancing over his shoulder, he said, "Come on. I need you to show me what's down in the canyon." There wasn't much to show, Kyra thought, but she nodded agreement and followed. When this whole thing had started, Jo had been the teacher she needed, her guide to the strange powers inside her. She had a feeling that, no matter what happened here, she was going to need a guide again. For both their sakes, she and Jo would have to stick together. Jerry Sen was not normally the type of man who ran around the galaxy seeking ancient and mysterious force-powered artifacts. The only reason he was at Khat Lah at all was because his brother Cade thought they needed to be. Frankly, between the spectral blue-white sunlight, the alien mystics, and the looming forbidden hypergate, this place was really creeping him out. He got distraction from an unusual source, the Yuuzhan Vong. His experience with those people was more than most in the civilized galaxy got, but still pretty limited. Most only spoke scraps of basic, the same way he only spoke scraps of Vong, but he was able to converse with several and get their stories. Unlike his old mentor Chanio, these ones had spent most of their lives on Zanima Second. They had that rigid honor Yuuzhan Vong were supposed to have, many bar ritual tattoos on their faces and a few even intentional scarring. Most belonged to the warrior caste, but he was surprised to find workers, extolled, even a priest and an apprentice shaper. All of them had one thing in common. When Khat Lah had arrived on Zanima Second 2 years ago and announced that he needed help, they'd volunteered. None had visited the wider galaxy before, and they didn't seem to understand it all too well now. Their loyalty to Khat Lah seemed absolute, but from what Jerry could tell, it wasn't any kind of cult-like following of a slavish leader. They seemed to view the inexplicably old warrior as a fellow student, more experienced than they but still making the same uncharted journey. They'd all joined Khat Lah for the same reason. They'd wanted to touch the Force, to know and feel it like he did. They'd gotten their wishes now, but from what Jerry could tell, many were ambivalent about their new gifts. He'd never had any hankering for magic powers himself, and judging from Cade's story, they were more trouble than they were worth. Jerry knew what he needed to get through life: 5 senses, a good head, and a better blaster. Frankly, he thought the galaxy as a whole would be better off without the Force, not that he said it to Cade. The Yuuzhan Vong were pretty forthcoming, probably since Jerry had an understanding of them most beings didn't. Yet there was one thing none of them talked about: what was on the other side of the gate. He gathered a few of them had died over there, but they refused to say how. Each time they clammed up, Jerry got the feeling that each Yuuzhan Vong was guarding a secret, less communal and more personal. As they waited for the droids to finish story time, and the Quad to decide who they let through the gate, Jiraiya explained all this to Cade and Delia. The Zeltron was clearly as weirded out by Khat Lah as Jerry and less interested in Vong stuff. "Damn it, Mishku, I don't like this," she told Cade. "Let Loie or Jo go through the gate. There's no reason you have to." "I don't know if I'll get the option," he said. "There's always an option." Delia's blue brows pressed together. "Stang, what's going on? Cade, you do what you want to do, not what someone tells you." "I know, Blue." He glanced down the canyon at the hypergate arch. "But I think whatever's over there, I want to see it. I've got to." She put a pink hand on his arm. "You got us this far. I figure you've done enough for your mom's memory." "It ain't just that. Just being here, I feel like I'm on this brink, and all I've got to do is take a few more steps before I fall into something way bigger and more powerful than I can imagine." "Is that a good thing?" Jerry asked warily. "I don't know. We've been to some weird places, Cade, but this is something else." Delia was blunt. "I don't like it. Biggest danger to us here are those Sith bars, and the Vong have them in hand." "On this side of the gate?" "Yes," said Jerry. "On the other side?" "Well, it's a good thing you're staying on this side. And don't worry about me." He gave them a cocky, so Cade grinned. "You all know I can handle myself just fine." Jerry knew when his brother was putting on a show, he also knew to let it go for now. The thing about Cade was that when he made a choice, he barged ahead without hesitation, even if he wasn't confident in the choice itself. The man did nothing in half measures. A whining sound filled the air, and the three of them turned to see the repulsor skiff they used for quick rides in and out of the canyon. This time it was lowering, and as it set down at the canyon floor, they could make out to those on board, Kyra and J.O. Assam. The imp knights had been cooped up on Mynock, healing from a lightsaber to the stomach. He'd never been down here before, and as he approached them, his head was lifted, eyes on the hypergate arch. The teenage girl had lower sights and a wary gaze on Jeriah. She'd been like this ever since they'd reached Rahakala. He knew well enough why. Back when Eli Horn had kidnapped those two on Tython, Jeriah had been forced to make some hard choices, one of which was pop a stun shot into Kyra while Eli was using her as a body shield in the hopes of stunning the Sith kid. 2. Things hadn't worked and they both been taken captive, but Jeriah had done the smart thing at the time and wasn't sorry. The girl was unused to being shot and was holding it against him. Well, that was her problem. He wouldn't apologize. As the two of them got close, Cade called, "Glad to see you're up and around, Imp Yuki. How's the side?" "Healed, more or less." J.O. placed a hand on abdomen. "I'm getting used to being functional again." "Take your time," said Delia. "Those wool keepers are." "Well, they've been here for 30,000 years or whatever," Cade said with a shrug. "What's another day or two?" "Well, we don't have to just wait," Kyra said, crossing arms. "J.O. and I think we should take Mynock out of the system and try to make a call." "I don't think calling a horde of imps down on the gate is what we need right now," said Cade. "I know that," said J.O., "but we should let someone know where we are. And we should check on what's happening in the rest of the galaxy. I remember things were starting to get hectic." "Fine by me," Delia said. "I could use a change of scenery." "I second that," added Jeriah. "I figured you Batistas would say that," Kay snorted. "Who do you plan to talk to?" "Ania if possible," J.O. said. "We want to check on her too," Kyra added. "Sounds reasonable," Kate allowed. "You should check with Loey and see if he wants to join." Out of the corner of his eye, Jeriah saw more approaching figures. Everyone else followed his eyes and stiffened at what they saw. Jeriah put one hand on his blaster as Darth Talon walked toward them. Her hands were free, and her lightsaber was clipped to her hip. 2 Yuuzhan Vong with amphistaffs followed her like a shadow. "Well, how you doing, little chica?" asked Cade. "Enjoying the lovely sunshine?" Talon looked briefly at the weird blue-white suns, then said, "I wish to leave this place." Delia snorted and said, "For once we're on the same page." "We should not be idle while the keepers of the Whills deliberate," the Twi'lek said. "We should at least take a ship outside the system, where we can cast a clear signal and communicate with the wider galaxy." Jeriah shook his head. "If you think we're letting you run off and tell all your Sith buddies to come, you've gone wormo. I'm not expecting that. I would, however, like to know what's been happening in the galaxy while we've been incommunicado." "You're not the only one," said J.O. "We were just talking about going up ourselves." Talon was taken aback for a moment. "Let me come with you." "You ain't in the position to be making demands," Kay said. She blinked, stared at him, and finally said, "Please." He snorted. "Staying, Sith learning manners. What next?" "Tell you what," said Jeriah, "we'll go up, come back down, and tell you everything we heard. We'll even let you listen to Mynock's conlog so you know we're not feeding you poodoo." Talon frowned, and Delia warned, "Not a bad offer, shudder. You should take it while it's on the table." With a tiny sigh, the Sith relented. "Very well. I accept. Give me your comlogs once you return." Cade wagged a finger. "Magic word, sweetheart." "Please?" She frowned. "Yeah, that's the one." Cade tapped Jeriah's arm. "Might as well start getting Mynock prepped." "Sounds good to me," he said. Delia was already starting toward the skiff. As he trotted to follow, it occurred that kicking a Sith while she was down might not be the best long-term plan, but right now she and her boy toy were pretty much subdued, and would be indefinitely so long as they were cut off from the Force. It was a good place for the rest of them to be in, and as far as Jeriah was concerned, cause for some well-needed optimism. Chapter 5. The settlement on conquered Daw's southernmost continent didn't look like much, but neither did any place else on the Mandalorian frontier world. Plowed fields stretched on for acres, and the structures at the center were a simple wooden farmhouse, 2 barns, and an unpretentious gathering hall. The only unusual thing about it was the number of starships parked next to the structures, and even those were nothing fancy. It was, in short, not the kind of place you'd expect galaxy-changing events to happen, but happening they were. Ania Solo had spent enough time among Mandas lately to know they'd get a kick out of that, but there wasn't any pleasure on Hondo Carr's face as he listened to Azlyn Rae and Ganner Krieg tell their story in full. The man's square face was locked in a tense frown, and his wife, Tess Vivek, looked no happier. After they finished the story, Azlyn passed a serious look around the group. "We realize this isn't much to go on," she admitted. "We know the Empress is alive, but we have no idea where she's being held. It could be any place in the galaxy." "Could be, but unlikely," said Ania's mother. Marin Skirata was gathered with the rest of them around the fire, and like Hondo she was hunched forward intently, elbows on knees. Hogram Chalk's entire rule rests on the idea that he's acting in the stead of his dead niece. He'll want to keep her close, on Coruscant. Probably in Galactic City itself. "Well, that narrows it down," Hondo said, voice rough with sarcasm. Tess looked at the 2 knights. "You said one of the Stormies taking the Empress away had an a Salamir?" Ganner supplied. "It's a creature that suppresses your ability to use the Force. Don't ask me how it works. I heard it's something that evolved naturally to evade predators on his homeworld, Mirkor." "Salamiri are extremely hard to raise off-world," Marin said. "They need native plants to survive, and it's almost impossible to get them to breed in captivity. Chalk doesn't just have 1 or 2 of the creatures. He got to have an entire support system if he plans to keep the Empress locked up indefinitely." That drew long looks from Ganner and Azlyn, probably wondering just how this strange old lady knew so much about obscure force-blocking critters. Anya interjected, "Do we know he plans to keep her locked up?" "You know, indefinitely. I know he's her uncle and all, but he could just kill her." Both knights shook their heads with the fierce denial of people faced by things too awful to contemplate. Ganner said, "According to the news nets, they found her body in the wreckage. We know she wasn't in her room where the bomb went off, which means Chalk faked that part of the evidence. That means he needs Marasiah alive and must be keeping her somewhere. Almost certainly on Coruscant." "Coruscant's a damn big planet," said Hondo. "That's not just trying to find a needle in a haystack. You're looking for a needle that's buried underground beneath the haystack. And the haystack's as big as a whole planet." "The Salamiri are a place to start," Marin said patiently. "If we can track the flow of these creatures and their supplies into Galactic City, we can get a lead on the Empress location." Tess said, "You'd still have to bust her out of wherever Chalk's got her, which is probably the most secure room in the galaxy." "I thought Mandalorians liked a challenge." Ganner sounded annoyed. "I like jobs that pay well and don't get me killed," said Hondo. "Now, I respect your loyalty to your Empress and all, but you've got to be reasonable. Even if you hired a couple boatfuls of Mandas somehow." "I have money," Anya said, though she'd never calculated how many Mandalorian boatfuls she could buy. "Even if you did, it's still a couple teams of mercs running into the heart of an interstellar empire with no outside help. I'm sorry, Nervold, but some challenges are just too much." Azlyn took a breath. "We may have some allies on Coruscant." "You mean the other Imperial Knights?" asked Salk. Ania's Mon Calamari crewmate had been quietly listening until now. The assassin droid AG-37 still stood tall and silent behind him, electric eyes blazing red in the night. "It's tricky," Azlyn admitted. "We don't know who we can trust, or how closely Chalk is watching the Knights." "You have to assume the worst," Hondo warned. "We know," Ganner said heavily. "But if anyone can give us a lead as to where those Salamiri supplies are going inside the palace, I'd bet it would be Master Sinde." Anya asked, "I take it he's someone important." "He's our most senior knight," said Azlyn. "He was a close friend to Roan Fel, and he'd never betray the Empress." Her own uncle did, Tez put in. But let that go for a second. If you can trust this Sen guy, fine, but you will still need more help than that. We know. Aslan looked at Hondo. After we left Coruscant, we tried to contact Anj Dal and that Alliance fleet that went MIA. We didn't have any luck. I've been trying to snare Anj on our rogue squadron freak, Hondo said. So far, no luck, but I'll keep trying. Do you really think the Alliance will help free the Empress? Asked Salk. Chalk is currently planning to put Admiral Stasi on trial for her murder, said Ganner. If the Empress suddenly shows up alive, and well, you know exactly what it means for Stasi. And Chalk. They might not be willing to risk acting aggressively on Coruscant, Tez warned. If they weren't willing to take risks, why'd they jump out of Bakura? Anya asked. No way to know any of that till we ask them, Hondo said with a sigh. I'll keep trying to contact Anj. No promises. I understand, Aslan said, then added, thank you very much. Hondo nodded, a little sourly. Marin, after a spell of notable silence, said, Sin may be able to help us track the Isolamary, but it would be good to know how they got to Coruscant in the first place. Mirker's never been a high-traffic world. I'm not sure if anyone's recording comings and goings there. But it's worth a look, Anya said, and it's not far from Mando space either. A day's way, maybe, Tess said. Anya looked at Salk, then AG-37. Well, guys, what do you say? Want to go for a little ride? It would be no problem whatsoever, said the assassin droid's tinny voice. Great, we can set out tomorrow. She looked back at the knights. Do either of you want to come? I don't know exactly what to look for once we get there. Neither do we, Ganner admitted, but there are certain ship models Imperial agents tend to use. I'll come with you. Aslan, you stay here in case you get in contact with Anj. Glad to have something like a plan, Hondo said and glanced at Marin. You staying or going? Aslan and Ganner gave her those questioning looks again. She ignored them and looked at the night sky. I could stand another ride. Anya felt a small flush of pleasure as the camp broke. Tez and Hondo retreated to their ship, the Black Justice. A G-37 and Salk started toward Free Agent, while Ganner and Aslan dipped into the darkness for some private words. That went a little better than I expected, Anya admitted as she stood up and stretched. What were you expecting? Oh, I don't know. I thought at least Hondo would come out and tell us this plan is totally mirror-sick, and we're shabla-dick-cute for even thinking about it. Marin smirked. You're starting to fit in. Not hardly. If I ever stick a bucket on my head and start singing war songs, I want you to shoot me. Anya crossed her arms but couldn't restrain a little smile. Still, thanks for helping. Marin looked down into the campfire. Mandalorians say family is more than blood, but it's still blood. I never met Marasiah, but I have to do something for her. In the silence of the night, Anya could hear the old ache in her mother's voice. There was still so much about the old woman she didn't know, like why she left the Jedi Order or what her relationship with her Fel cousins had been. There were layers of years and pain there, and even after what they'd been through it was forbidding to peel them away. Quietly, Anya said, this Master Send guy, you know him, right? Marin looked at her sideways. Are you sure you don't have the Force? I've got good instincts. Those are more reliable lately. I knew Tree Sende a long time ago. And you think he's honorable? I think he was. After all that time, who knows how people change? Marin was certainly one to talk. Ania's mother had been a Jedi apprentice, a Jedi Ranger, a part-time Mandalorian, and finally a civilian freighter pilot, wife, and mother before losing everything and throwing herself into a long quest against the ruling Mandalore, Yaga Arches. That was over now, and to Ania's eyes it seemed like a heavy weight had been lifted from Marin's shoulders. That was good to see, but it was hard to know what could come after a quest like that. They were apparently going to find out together, which seemed cause for optimism. There weren't enough of those nowadays, and Anya was glad to have just one to call her own. After their victory against Darth Krayt, The Imperial Knights had been flooded with applicants whose skills ranged from preternatural force talent to wishful thinking. Those had been heady days, and the newly built training center of the Knights, directly appended to the also new Executive Palace complex, had seemed packed with life and energy. After Miladi's virus swept through his ranks, nearly all of those recruits had fallen back to their old homes in disappointment. The retention rate among anointed knights was something to be proud of, but the tall, broad halls seemed bleakly empty now. Maybe that was why Sinde, who'd never been a man to leave from his desk, was spending more time in his office. He had 2 knights he knew he could rely on in front of him. To Yalta Val he said, "The Regent has finally decided we can be of some use in tracking down Senator Darrell. You've spent a lot of time in the field, Master Val, so I want you to begin aggressively pursuing contacts aboard. Cast a wide net. By now Darrell could anywhere. Inner rim, outer rim, anywhere." The other man, 20 years younger than Sin and with barely any gray in his beard, nodded. "Should I start asking my less-than-legal clients?" "That's exactly who Regent Chalk wants you to look into. He's giving you permission to enlist 10 other knights of your choosing and whatever ships you need. If you think you have a lead, chase it across the stars if you have to." "I'm glad we are finally being let off our leashes," said Siegel Dare. A good 10 years younger than Val and under half Sin's age, the woman had such a sculpted and stern face she could have passed for an empress herself. "Is the Regent finally admitting his spinet isn't up the job?" "He most certainly isn't," Sin said. "He's intensifying the search for Darrell because he's decided to move up the timetable for the trial, and he very much wants the senator to be there along with Stasi, Kaiga, and Nelrin." "When does he plan to start?" asked Val. "He hasn't announced it publicly yet, but he's looking at 2 weeks. 2 weeks. That's moving very fast. He wants to get it done with. That's going to be a very messy trial," Dare said, "especially with that Alliance fleet still unaccounted for. Security is going to be a nightmare." "Indeed," Sin said, almost thankful for the segue. "In fact, Regent Chalk had decided that you should be in charge of it." The woman's face slacked with shock. "Me? Did he ask for me personally?" "He did. He knows your loyalty and professionalism very well, Master Dare. He also knows your desire to see Marasiah's killers brought to justice." "And Master Draco's." Her eyes narrowed. "For the crimes against us, someone has to be punished. Harshly?" "I agree," said Sinde, but stopped short of voicing his doubts. He told no one about the short, ambiguous com he'd gotten from Aslan and Ganner. He heard other knights talking about their disappearance, variously wondering if they deserted, been murdered, or even been involved in the Emperor's murder, though they only said the last in whispers. Nobody had reported contact with them. "Where does the Regent plan to hold the trial?" asked Val. "He wants to do this properly. They'll use a courtroom." Treese wagged a finger over his shoulder, gesturing in the direction of the Judicial Center. Along with the nearby Department of Transit and Financial Investigation Bureau buildings, it was one of a handful of government structures not wrecked during the retaking of Coruscant 3 years ago. "That entire building will have to be put on lockdown," Dare said. "I know. The Regent says he looks forward to working with you closely to prepare. Never one to back away from a challenge." The woman set her face back to stern and nodded. "I'll do whatever is necessary, sir." "I'm sure you will. Thank you, Siegel." "A question," said Yalta Val. "There aren't enough knights to work security for the entire judicial complex. We'll be mostly using extant security staff, correct?" "Of course. What about the Jedi? Have they been asked to take part?" Treese turned from them to his window. Through the transparent steel plane he had a good north-facing view of the government district. Low buildings and extra-wide skylines created a sense of imperious space, and the main executive buildings rose as pyramids or towers. He could see the drum-shaped Judicial Center 2 kilometers directly north, the Transit and Finance towers past it and to the west. Further still, some 3 kilometers away, was the low pyramid of the Jedi Temple. Treese went there occasionally on official business. Lately it felt even more hollow than the Imperial Knights building. Watching the Jedi Temple, and the faint reflections of the knights behind him, Tree said, I understand, an offer has been made to the Jedi to be part of the security team. Best I know, they haven't accepted. We don't need Jedi, Siegel said sourly. They generally have alliance sympathies. I understand the regent wants to look inclusive, but the Jedi will be more a liability than a help. I'm afraid I have to agree, Val said. The Jedi are honorable, but not always reliable. Ultimately, that's not your choice. The regent has made the offer. I imagine the Jedi Council is pondering it now. He's given them a dilemma, Val said thoughtfully. Reject it, and they separate themselves further from the government. Accept it, and they accept complicity in whatever the outcome of the trial is. Even if they recuse themselves and try to stay neutral, it won't look that way. Trace turned back around. You have a good read on politics, Master Val. Some knights, and many Jedi, would have taken that as an insult, but Val just nodded. I suppose he's just repeating how he's handled the Senate. The Senate is going along with the trial. How they'll react when they see the evidence, I don't know. Dare asked, have you seen any of that evidence, Master Sinde? Tree shook his head. The regent insists his investigators have it well in hand. Or, he thought guiltily, the regent was busy manufacturing whatever fake evidence he needed to convict his political enemies. Whatever happens, the trial will be a turning point, Dare said. We'll find out who our real allies are, and our enemies. Val nodded, and so did Trees, half-heartedly. The trial would be a climax of sorts, he was sure of that, but he increasingly doubted it would bring revelation. Until he spoke to Ganner and Aslan again, Trees didn't think he could be sure of anything. Chapter 6. The lightspeed jump from Khat Lah lasted all of a standard minute before the light show of hyperspace returned to black. They were on the very edge of the galactic disk, and a band of milky light stretched from one side of the cockpit viewport to another. Aside from that, only a few faint stars twinkled in a vast black. It was a strange and lonely sight, and it gave Kyra a chill as she sat in Minok's cockpit. Jiraiya and Delia, manning the pilot and co-pilot stations, just seemed relieved to be off Khat Lah. As the ship drifted in deep space, Delia stared up the communications console and ran checks. Are we out of that interference zone? Asked Jael. He stood up and leaned over the back of her chair. Yeah, we look good to transmit, the Zeltron said. Are we going to call your Munichika? We're calling Ania. And she's not. Anything you say, Imbuki? Delia tapped the controls. We've still got her hailing freak on the computer. Let's see if it works. Kyra edged close to Jael and watched over her Delia's shoulder. Over the past year, their contact with Ania Solo had been sporadic at best as both Minok and Free Agent darted ceaselessly around the galaxy. Kyra knew that, just as she owed Jael a lot, she owed Anya even more. If the older woman hadn't taken a shine to her back on Socorro, she'd still be there, slaving away in Rav's petty kingdom. They waited for some long, 10 seconds before the console beeped and a blue holoimage resolved in front of them. Jael sighed with relief at the sight of Ania's pale, round face. Anya, can you hear us? He said, hunching close over Delia. Kyra shouldered in, joining him inside the holo transmitter's range of vision. I hear you, Jael, she said. See you too, and Delia and Kyra. We've got Jerry here too, the Zeltron added. It's been a long time, Jael said seriously. You've missed a lot. I was going to tell you the same thing, said Anya. Who gets to go first? I will. Jael took a breath and pressed on. He explained that they found Khat Lah along with an operable hypergate. It had been too long since they talked, and Anya hadn't even known they'd been chasing the hypergate at all. Jael hurried through the explanation, barely mentioning their near-fatal involvement in the Nagai raid on Cerberus before getting back to the current dilemma. Kyra noted that he omitted everything about the Sith and his near-fatal wound. We don't know if these guardians of the gate will let us through, he said. It sounds like they might take some of us, but they're not cluing us in as to whom. But if you go through, you can get the Force back? Apparently. The Yuuzhan Vong here can't all touch the Force. That's what Skywalker says, anyway. And if it works for them, it should work for anybody. Ania's holographic gaze shifted slightly. Delia, have you ever wanted to read people's minds? I'm an empath, darling, the Zeltron reminded. I can read people, just not Jedi tear. Then have you ever wanted to lift stuff with your mind and fight crazy battles against superpowered evil guys? No, Delia said, but I end up doing the second part anyway. You and me both, Ania said dryly, then looked to Kyra. What do you think? Would you go through the gate? If she didn't, Kyra thought dryly, the past year really had been a waste. They talk about it like it's dangerous, and they won't say how. But I think I would, yes. Ania nodded, acceptance. Jo asked, what about you, Ania? You said you had things to tell us. She sighed too, then explained it all. She talked about helping her mother's campaign against the Mandalore Yaga-Ochus, which she'd been reticent to speak of before. She explained how the hunt had involved them in the Nagai and SS Siruvi wars in the Outer Rim, and the dramatic twist where Ania's mother had sided with Yaga-Ochus to take down the Sith driving those campaigns. She explained in detail the confrontation at Bakura, where Ochus himself had shot Darth Nil, reigning Dark Lord of the Sith, dead. You're really sure? Jo gasped. I was standing right next to Nil when the laser bolt scrambled his brain, Ania said. I'm sure. He's dead. And when Nil went down, Ox ordered all his Mandas to turn on their Nagai buddies. From what I heard, they specifically targeted any ship they knew had a Sith aboard and vaped it. Why did Ochus switch sides? Asked Kyra. Long story, but he wanted to get out from the Sith's thumb. So the Sith? Jo hesitated, like he was afraid to even speak the possibility. They're gone. For good, this time. I don't know. We thought that after the Battle of Floating World, and there were still some around. But their ships got vaped. Nil's dead. One of the other big ones, she thought for a name. Darth Havoc, he's been captured on Coruscant. Probably dead too. How do you know that? Asked Delia. On your side again? That's another long story. She plunged into that one next, explaining the frantic events on Coruscant that followed the Nil's defeat. Kyra had been totally blind to all of it, and by the time Ania explained that she was en route to Mirkor, looking for clues to finding the supposedly dead but really imprisoned Empress Fel, Kira's head felt like it was spinning. When Ania was done, Delia grunted, the galaxy just doesn't give you a rest, does it? Apparently not, Ania said, but we can't just let Marasiah rot in some jail while her uncle runs the show. Jeria, who'd been silent this whole time, said, you know, I think I like relaxing on Weird Force planets after all. Kyra looked to Jo. The indecision on his face was plain, and she asked, what do you want to do? You don't need to come running, Ania said. I think we have help already. Man, no help? He asked. The best of stolen pirates money can buy. Besides, you've only got one ship, right? 2, said Delia. Bumped into some Sith on the way. Don't worry, we've got him under control. Ania's expression darkened. I hope so. They might be the last 2 Sith in the galaxy. I can't wait to give him the news, Jeria said with a mean grin. Listen, said Delia, I'll send you the coordinates for Rahikala at the end of this message. Right now we haven't told anybody what we found. Not the Jedi, not to the Imp Knights. With all that's happening on Coruscant, it's not safe to tell the Knights, Jo said regretfully. How are the Jedi handling all this? They're still there. Honestly, it's like most people have forgotten they existed, Ania said regretfully. Without the Force, they don't matter much. Jeria snorted. You know, there was a time I'd have loved seeing the Jedi lose everything that made them special. Hell, it's still kind of fun. But it didn't go quite how you expected, said Jo. The other man nodded. Listen, you guys can do what you have to there, said Ania. We'll keep trying to find the Empress. If something big comes up for either one of us, we'll contact each other, said Jo. We've spent too long flying in separate directions. Agreed. Ania smiled softly. We're actually coming up on our destination pretty soon, so I should sign off and get prepped. Understood. It's good hearing from, said Jael. Good to be heard. I'll see you all around. Ania reached for her controls, and then her smiling face vanished. Silence took hold in Minek's cockpit as everyone processed what they'd heard. Kyra had been so busy here she'd forgotten the rest of the galaxy was still in flux. The situation sounded more dangerous than ever, and her thoughts went back to Severus, where the death and ruin wreaked by the nigga had made her physically ill. That memory led back to Svivern a decade back, and the bombing that had wrecked the city and killed her parents. The galaxy deserved peace after so much strife. Kids deserved to grow up with their families. Things were tipping toward chaos yet again, and she felt a chill go through her. Lobaka and Jael had both told her that the role of Knight Jedi, or Imperial, was to secure peace and justice in the galaxy. Scoundrels like Jiraiya groused that the galaxy was a better place without Force users making trouble, but he was wrong. Peace and justice didn't come about on their own. They needed to be fought for, gained, and maintained. The galaxy needed the Force back. It needed the power sealed on Khat Lah. As Mynock adjusted course and turned his nose toward a faint blue-white double star, Kyra felt certain she was going exactly where she needed to be. Chapter 7. Aside from unique native fauna, there seemed little of note about Mirker. When the freighter Free Agent exited hyperspace, the planet lay dead ahead, a somewhat dowdy green and brown sphere, orbited by one small airless moon, and no spacecraft that their sensors could pick up. According to the navigation catalog Ganner had read en route, the forested world had been a smuggler hideout for centuries, then fallen into greater obscurity after its conquest by the Yuuzhan Vong. Perhaps because it had no cities or technology of note, the invaders had spared at the Vong forming that had devastated Duro, Coruscant, and dozens of other planets. As Free Agent drew closer, Ganner hovered in the back of the cockpit, watching the ship's crew run through sensor checks with a dull disappointment. He wasn't sure what kind of lead he'd expected to pick up here, but it looked like there was no lead at all. It filled him with frustration and anger, the kind that had been welling inside him ever since losing the Force, and which grew harder to contain with every mounting tragedy. Once he'd been considered one of the Imperial Knights' most calm and thoughtful members, without the Force as his constant guide, he felt himself fraying, growing more desperate with every setback. He needed to save Marasiah, but even more he needed the Force back. He wasn't sure if he could keep living without it and wasn't sure if he wanted to. From the co-pilot seat, Ania Solo released a sigh. Well, this looks like a whole lot of nothing. I am forced to concur, said AG-37. I detect no spacecraft in orbit. There are no thermal trails or particle traces detectable, which indicates no spaceflight in this region for at least the past 70 hours. It felt profoundly weird to have a polite-speaking, independent-minded assassin droid sitting behind the helm of the ship. Apparently, AG-37 was actually owner and operator of Free Agent, and Ganner was just starting to comprehend the importance of the name. The droid, he thought, must have an interesting story to tell. I'm not getting any signs of habitation on the surface either, said the Mon Calamari Salk. Drop into low orbit and try again, suggested the old woman, Marin Scarata. I think those trees have mineral traces that mess up most ship scanners. It's why this planet became a smuggler's nest in the first place. Don't get too close, Anya warned. We don't want to rouse up unfriendly locals either. I assure you, I will tread the careful line, said AG-37 as he pitched the ship into a controlled descent. AG-37 leveled out in the upper atmosphere, and Ganner held tight to a console to steady himself against the bumpy ride. Marin leaned over Ania's shoulder to carefully watch the sensor data coming up on the co-pilot's console. Ganner had read the reports on Ania Solo and her gang and heard a little firsthand from Antares and Marasiah. He'd known about Ania herself, her droid and her Mon Cal mechanic. The old woman was new and he didn't know what to make of her. She was apparently a Mandalorian, but she knew things you wouldn't expect from a typical buckethead commando. As he watched her lean close to Ania, he had to wonder if they were related. The ages looked about right for mother and daughter, but they didn't look that much alike, Ania had a rounded face while Marin's features were sharper, and the older woman was taller besides. Ganner wasn't clear on how Ania was related to Marasiah exactly, but he recalled that Antares had once gone on a mission to Mandalore with Eshkar 9 and a single woman, apparently a freighter pilot with Mandalorian family connections. Roan Fel had personally spoken to that woman to enlist her help, and Antares had been confused why his emperor would meet with a lowly civilian like that. It didn't mean anything for sure, but Ganner held the fact in the back of his mind as he watched the Scarada woman. Free agent completed 2 full circuits around Mirkor, first to scan the northern hemisphere, then the lower. When they were done, Salk shook his head. I still don't see anything. Those trees might be getting in the way still, and I'm not sure what else we could do. Disappointment was palpable in the cockpit. Ania muttered, well, we all knew this was a long shot. As the freighter peeled upward, out of the atmosphere and into a smooth vacuum flight, Marin glanced out the viewport at the distant pale gray sphere of Mirkor's only moon. Her eyes narrowed as she said, give that thing a flyby. After a tiny pause, Ania asked, you think we'll find something? I think it's worth checking out, Marin said ambiguously. I will take us in for a closer look, a G-37 said as he worked the controls. Free agent accelerated smoothly. As the moon grew steadily larger in the center of the viewport, Salk said, that moon doesn't have any atmosphere to speak of. I'll scan for unusual metals and heat signatures. Ganner, still on his feet, clung to the back of Salk's chair as free agent pulled closer to the moon. They were close enough to make out the ridges and crater pockmarks on its surface, but not anything unusual. As the ship drew closer still, a G-37 nudged it into the moon's orbit. Nobody spoke, everyone watched scanners and waited. It was Salk who finally said, I think I've got something. It's definitely a heat signature, temps way above vacuum cold. On the moon's surface? Asked Ganner. Right? The Mon Cal tapped his console. Do you see it, AG? Affirmative, said the droid. I will take us closer. A G-37 nudged the controls again, and the freighter dropped closer to the moon's jagged surface. Like Ania and Marin, Ganner leaned forward to squint, looking for any discoloration or angular geometry that would indicate a settlement. And then, without warning, the comm console buzzed. As Ania reached out to answer it, Salk reported, I'm getting more signatures. They look like ships. They did at that. Ganner could spot them with his naked eyes now, a half-dozen distant lights twirling up from the moon and vectoring toward them. Snub fighters, probably. They must have gotten too close to a nest of pirates or smugglers. Ania tapped the comm console and was greeted by a harsh voice saying, repeat, surrender your vessel or be destroyed. Is running away an option? Ania asked. Because I take that one. Lower your shields and prepare to be boarded, or we'll blast you back to atoms. She turned off the console and looked at the others. I think we got a little too close to their hideout. They'd rather kill us than let us run and spill their secret. Not a good introduction, Ganner thought as he watched the starfighters get close. As they began circling free agent, he made them out, old craft with long pointed noses, 4 thrust engines, and 4 jutting S-foils tipped by a lance-like laser cannon. X-wings, Marin said in disbelief. A strange smile creased her face. Oh, that takes me back. Income X-wings have been common over a century ago. Ganner gave the woman a look. She was old, but not that old. We can't handle museum pieces like those, can't we? Ganner asked. That depends on the level of modifications given to these craft, said AG-37. Shields are up. Weapons are hot. Ania, would you please man the concussion missile launchers? Already on it, she said. I'll take the direct gun, Marin said, and turned to her own console. Ganner felt uncomfortably helpless as the X-wing continued to circle. As yet they hadn't fired, not even a warning shot, which suggested these pirates or whoever they were had a bark worse than their bite. Of course, if they were trying to scare free agent off, they could have just let them go. Salk checked his scanners again. Something else is lifting off from the moon. A couple somethings. Looks like D-Wing assault fighters. Those are almost contemporary, Ania said under her breath. They're also heavily armed, added Marin. Can this ship handle itself against military-grade heavy assault craft? I would prefer not to find out, said the droid. Then we should cut and run before the D-Wings get here, said Ganner. They should, but AG-37 didn't touch the control. Softly, Ania said, this could be our opportunity, guys. To get blown up for no reason. Warble sulk. The comm unit buzzed again. Ania slapped it with a sigh, and a voice said, this is your last chance. Surrender your craft now and prepare to be boarded or we'll destroy you where you are. Listen, we're willing to be reasonable. We didn't mean to trespass on your little hideaway, and if we could just speak to somebody in charge. Never. The voice snapped. You've invaded the property of the great Vogma the Hutt and you will be punished. Ganner had never heard of that particular crime lord, but it was hard to keep track of them lately. Ania and Marin, though, spun in their seats and stared at each other for a long moment. Then, incredibly, both women burst out laughing. Oh, Sithspit, that's too good, Ania said. What do you think? They just picked him at random. Marin shrugged. Maybe. If they chose Vito or some real gangster, they might run into his real goons by accident. Not so Vogma. I guess it's not too stupid an idea. So how do you want to handle this? There was a flash of plasma, and shields scattered across their forward bow, and the cockpit rocked. Ganner bleated. Does someone want to tell me what's so funny? Ania ignored his question and asked Marin, do you want to go right to the source on this? I think it's worth a try. Hopefully he's not in a meeting right now. As the X-Wing circled ominously, and the D-Wings drew into view, Ania and Marin switched places. The older woman dropped in front of the comm console and typed in what looked like a long, complicated calling code. She waited some 20 seconds before a holoimage sprung up, containing the wide head and wider shoulders of a Hutt. Ah, what an unexpected call, the Hutt rumbled in passable basic. I presume there's a special occasion. Actually, more of an emergency. I'm dealing with some nasty pirate types in the Mirror system who claim to be working for you. My guess is they think throwing a Hutt's name around will increase their clout and scare intruders. Whom? Outrageous. Vogma thundered. I have been a legitimate business being for 2 standard centuries. I will not accept this shameless slander against my name. Let me speak to them immediately. Marin smiled tightly. I had a feeling you'd say that. Give me a second. She worked the console, shrinking the holo and connecting Vogma with the pirate types on the moon for a 3-way call. She said, can you hear me down there? We heard you clearly, the harsh voice from before said. Surrender at once or we will open fire. Is the name of your boss Vogma the Hutt? A tiny pause. Then, yes, of course. Do you surrender? How dare you? A Hutt voice interrupted. I am Vogma Angeliac. I am a legitimate business being, and I will not allow you to appropriate my good name as cover for your criminal enterprises. The once harsh voice was satisfyingly shocked. We. I know what you are, Vogma went on, petty criminals claiming to be part of a syndicate. And you thought any Hutt would do. That is slander against my person and my race. I demand an apology. I demand one right now. There was a long pause. Then the voice on the other end asked a question in Huttese. Ganner didn't understand the words, but the tone was supplicatory. Vogma's response was in the same language, as vehement as before. The conversation went back and forth for another minute, and the pirate sounded increasingly cowed. Those X-Wings and D-Wings were still circling Free Agent, but no more warning shots were fired. Leaning forward, Ganner asked, who is this Hutt? Old friend of the family, Marin said with a cryptic smile. We go way back. During the war, Ganner had the exciting and exasperating experience of working with Cade Skywalker's crew. This one might give them a run for their money. Soon the snub fighters peeled away and retreated toward the moon. Vogma, more subdued but still grumpy, said, the criminals have been chastened and will not bother you again. I suspect they'll be vacating this little base shortly. Good to know, said Marin. Thank you, Avogma. Thank you for alerting me to their nefarious actions and letting me set them straight. Is there anything else you need? Nothing comes to mind. I'll talk to you later, Vogma. The Hutt nodded as best as a Hutt could, and his holo winked out. With a satisfied breath, Marin pushed out of the co-pilot's chair and let Ania take her place. So that's it, asked Ganner. We can go. Why would we go? Asked Ania. This is exactly what we came here for. We wanted to know if anybody's been dipping in and out of Mirkor recently, and who'd know better than these guys. Eagerly, she tapped the comm console. A second later, that same voice returned, sounding suitable chastened. We've already reached an accord with Vogma and Gilead. We have no quarrel with you. Please leave. After what you tried to pull, I think you owe us and Vogma a little something in return. Don't worry, we've got something specific in mind, and it won't give you much trouble. Ania leaned forward and smiled. All we need is a little information. Anjdal nudged the stick of her crossfire, pushing the starfighter into a long, slow turn. She was back patrolling again, leading her wingmates on a lazy loop around the Alliance as it sat in the same spot of empty space. There were plenty of pilots in the fleet who could have flown the patrol, but she'd volunteered to go out again, just a day after her last flight. She'd never been good at sitting around, and she needed to at least delude herself she was doing something worthwhile. The hum of the Crossfire's cockpit was a comfort, but after the first 30 minutes boredom began to nag at her, and with boredom came anxiety. She started to imagine all the ways this isolated stand could end, and none of them were good. Reverie was interrupted by a buzz from her comm console. Ange frowned. It was an incoming transmission, but didn't seem to be from the fleet. Before she could check it, Rogue 3 asked, "Is anyone else getting that signal?" "I am too. It looks encrypted," said Rogue 4. The newest pilot in the unit, she'd been unlucky enough to join right before the campaign against the SSI Ruach. Ange tapped her console and looked at the readout. She recognized the alphanumeric string immediately and said, "All pilots, sit tight and do not respond. I'll answer the call from here." It was the frequency the rogues had used to communicate in secret during the war with Cade. Precious few pilots from that conflict were still with the squad, and none of them on Ange's wing now. As she entered her decryption key, she wondered which ex-rogue could be calling. Monia Gayam was the option that sprung to mind first. When the comm system accepted her key, Anne said, "This is Rogue Leader responding. Rogue 5, reporting in." She recognized the voice instantly. "Staying, Hondo. I wasn't expecting you. Thought our business was done, did you?" She had. Thanks to Hondo and his rogue commandos, Admiral Stasi had been able to forge a pact with Mandalore Yaga Archers, which in turn had allowed them to dismember the Sith SSI Ruvi Nagai coalition that had been mucking up the Outer Rim. That glow of victory had lasted mere hours, and she'd barely thought about the whole thing since Alliance went into hiding. "You know my situation, don't you, Hondo?" "I do. Not the specifics, only the general. This can't be a social call." "It's not. I had some very interesting strays wind up in my lap." "What kind of interesting?" "The kind that says they really need to talk to your people." This comm line was supposed to be super secure, but Ange heard hesitation in his voice. "About what? Give me something more specific." "They've got a story about what happened to the Empress that diverges pretty far from the official tale. And I'm pretty sure they're telling the truth." "Are you saying you trust them?" "Yeah, I do," he said after a pause. "I'm not saying to give them the coordinates to wherever you are, but you might want to send somebody to talk to them." "And where are you now?" "Conquer-Dom. I can pipe you specific coordinates when you show up." "When I show up?" "Who else would the Admiral trust with the top secret, high-importance mission?" "No need to flatter, Hondo. I'll take your request to the Admiral. Then we'll be on the lookout. Hail me again with this freak when you reach the Conquer system." With an unceremonious click, the transmission closed. Anne sank into her seat and exhaled. Hondo was acting damn confident that she'd do exactly as he requested, but then, he was Hondo. His brazen bets had a tendency to pay off. She still didn't understand the half of what was going on, but her interest was certain piqued. And she thought, a mission to conquer Dawn would be a hell of a lot more interesting than staying here, waiting for nothing to happen. Ange flipped her comm system back to local frequency. Something came up, she explained. I'm heading back to base. Rogue 2, take point and complete the patrol as scheduled. Understood, Rogue Leader. Ange jerked the control stick, angled the nose of her fighter toward Alliance, and kicked the engines. Inertia pinned her to the back of her chair, and she felt a small rush of adrenaline. Hondo was right, of course. Whatever this new mission entailed, she'd see it through to the end. Upon their arrival at Afrin IV, Sare concluded that her husband's judgment was correct. This was, indeed, a good world to be overlooked on. The urban centers were small and scattered across vast continents covered by mountains and forests. The homestead occupied by Samin Douglas was located some 5 kilometers outside one of those towns, and to get there Sare and Porat had to walk an uphill forest trail. It was the kind of place someone settled if they wanted to get away from the galaxy's greater drama. Samin herself was a Togruta. She looked middle-aged and her skin was shades of blue and forest green, more subdued than usual for her species. They'd given her no advance warning of their arrival, but when they knocked on the primitive wooden swing door to her home, Samin opened it and looked at them without surprise. It's been a long time, Porat said. I'm sorry to intrude on you here, but the situation's gotten rather desperate. If you let us in, we can explain. Samin looked from him to Sare, then back to him. I know this place looks simple, she said, but we do get the HoloNet. Of course, Porat gave a polite politician's smile. May we come in? Samin nodded and stepped back, leaving the door hinged open. Sare entered first, Porat behind her. The house's insides matched the outsides, wooden walls and floorboards, simple decorations and tools. Sare asked, did you and your husband build this yourselves? We had some help, Samin said. Local contractors, mostly. She eyed the young Chagrian carefully, uncertain what to make of the woman who'd followed Porat in flight. To her and the rest of the galaxy, Sare was just a civilian refugee and well over her head. Only Porat knew what she'd already endured, and what she was capable of. You like privacy? That's good, Porat said as he surveyed the room. Don't worry. We're not going to ask you to shelter us. Samin relaxed slightly. You want me to contact Tanter, don't you? Porat nodded. He told me once that he shared one of our secret confrex with you. He insisted we be able to contact each other in any emergency. She gave a small smile. Sare asked, have you spoken to him since Base Fleet went missing? No. I haven't risked it. I strongly doubt anyone is monitoring communications from here. Porat took in the cabin with the wave of a hand. True. Samin crossed her arms. If you want me to be honest, I haven't tried to contact Tanter because I'm afraid I might not be able to. If Chalk had found Base Fleet, we'd know by now. They'd be trumpeting victory over the news nets. Maybe, said Sare. That wouldn't go over well with Brighton and the senators, though. I really doubt Chalk cares what the Senate thinks, Porat growled. The man's determined to stamp out every trace of democracy in this galaxy and replace it with old-style imperial authority. Sare held in a reply. Sometimes Porat's alliance ardor blinded him to the nuances of politics. It seemed clear to her that Hogram Chalk was playing a careful game, keeping his enemies close and eliciting their cooperation, if not their loyalty. He was trying to solidify his rule, while also sustaining the power structure he'd inherited from the previous ruler. It was, she thought bitterly, much the same thing her father had done after Krait's apparent death. Darth Wirelock had been unable to sustain his power play and died because of it. Whether Chalk would do better remained to be seen. He, at least, had the advantage of replacing someone who would stay dead. Porat turned his impassioned stare to Samin. Please, help us contact your husband. We'd like to join Admiral Bay's fleet, if we can. I'm not sure that's really the safest place for you to be, the Togruta said. I don't want to be safe. I want to help free Admiral Stasi and restore democracy to the galaxy. Getting in touch with base fleet is the first step to doing that. Saray restrained a smile, as if he'd respond any other way. Sabine tilted her head thoughtfully. Tanter was right about you. He always said you walked the line between foolish and brave. All of us did back then. Tanter too. If we hadn't, the galaxy would still be under Krait's heel. I know. When the war ended, I tried to talk him into retiring. He said he would, and help build our house here, but he didn't give up his commission. Just a little longer, he kept telling me. And now look what happened. She closed her eyes, exhaled. Give me a few minutes. I'll prepare the comm system and see if I can reach Tanter. Thank you. I'd repay you if I could. Consider it an act of patriotism. She opened her eyes and looked at Saray. If you want to stay here with me, I think I can shelter you. She shook her head. I'm staying with Porat. I thought you'd say that, Sabine said, without judgment. She turned and left the room through a side door, leaving Porat and Saray temporarily alone. Quietly, he said, they probably won't give us direct coordinates to the fleet. They'll send a shuttle out to fetch us. We should be ready to ditch our ship in deep space somewhere. I know, she whispered. They waited for a minute, listening to the sound of movement in the other room. A low humming sounded through the walls as a power generator fired up. This truly was a simple life Sabine had made for herself. Maybe Tanter had planned to join her here, maybe not. It was the kind of existence Porat had never wanted, and neither had Saray, not in either of her lives. The powerful rage and cruelty of the Sith seemed like a dream to her now, vanished along with the Force, but her father had taught her other traits that stuck. Precision, self-discipline, pragmatism. Most all, he taught her ambition. Saray could never retire to a cabin in the woods and let history pass her by. Porat was the same. Though they started in the most different places, something had brought them to the same place in the end. Perhaps it had been the Force itself, imparting fresh destiny as one last gift to Saray. It was possible, but she hoped it wasn't true. The Force empowered you, but it overwhelmed you too, twisting your senses and perceptions. She saw more clearly without it and was glad to have it gone. The door opened again, and Sabine poked her head into the room, breaking Saray's reverie. The Togruta said, "Come in. I have Tanter on the line, and he can't wait to speak to you." Chapter 8. When Mynock returned from his away mission, Jerry Asen came to Darth Talon with a single data playback rod. He said nothing as he handed it to her, but his smile was tight-lipped, his eyes dark with satisfaction. She knew there was nothing good on the recording, but a Sith did not give in to fear. Talon listened to it right away. She sat in the cave and played with while Eli, unawares, restlessly walked the canyon floor below. Most of the voices were easy to decipher. Sin himself, Delia Blue, Imperial Knight J.O. Assam. One female voice clearly belonged to the young woman Kyra, whose history and purpose Talon was still uncertain of. The fifth voice chimed faintly with her memory of Ania Solo, cousin of Marasiah Fel and killer of Darth Red. It was that voice that delivered the hammer blow. Lord Nil, dead. Lord Havoc, dead or imprisoned. It sounded like the others had been routed, many or most killed. She didn't even know who would assume the title of Dark Lord with Nil and Havoc gone. Neither of them had had the vision of Darth Krayt, but they still had ambition, ferocity, and determination. Perhaps there was no leader. Perhaps the Sith were scattered. Perhaps they were all dead, all of them except for her. The thought stabbed icy terror in her chest. She'd been taught to harness her fear, use it, and turn it into strength, but that was so hard without the Force. Even with it, she wasn't sure she could tame the fear. She got up and paced anxiously in the cave, staring into dark shadows to avoid the questioning eyes of her Yuuzhan Vong watchers. All of her life she had served. She'd given herself wholly to Lord Krayt's vision, trusted that vision, killed her own master, and surrendered her life countless times. Krayt had been killed, his vision too, but still she moved on, serving the Sith even as he trust in Darth Nil quietly eroded, serving because serving was all she'd ever know. Even when the Force had been stolen from her, She devoted herself to serving the dark side as remembered in her heart. Without a higher cause, she would truly be nothing. Eventually, Talon walked onto the canyon ledge and looked out. Rahakala's twin suns cast everything in a spectral blue-white glow, and she wondered if perhaps she was dead and there's some strange afterlife. She would rather die than live without the Force to give her strength and the Sith to give her purpose. Her lightsaber was still at her belt, the one thing that hadn't been stolen from her. She could take it in hand now, plunge it into her breast, and end it. Talon had never thought about killing herself before. The very idea had been repulsive, a selfish waste. But now, as her palm brushed its hard, smooth surface, the weapon felt like a comfort. It was the one thing that would not fail her. A shudder ran through her and she pulled her hand back. She could not give in to those bleak thoughts. She would not. Frantic and fearful, she groped for escape. The recording may have been a cruel trick, something fixed up by Sin and even Ania Solo to torture her, but it had been a lone recording, and everything in their voices had sounded authentic. There might be some other Sith still alive. There had to be. Sith were canny. Sith were survivors. Sith were not wiped out by treacherous vermin. It had been true once, but without the Force, maybe the Sith were mere vermin after all. She had to find out for sure. Her lightsaber was more than just promise of oblivion. It was her chance to escape. She could fight her way to the ship. Eli would be helpful with that, at least with running interference. She could escape, jump clear of the system, and make a wide broadcast on the frequency the one Sith used to communicate in emergencies. Some of them would be alive. Some of them would hear her. They would rush to her side, and together the last scraps of the Sith would return to Rahakala, break through the gate, and seize the power locked away there. And then, rejuvenated and in touch with the dark side, they could destroy the gate to seal that power away, then compel the whole galaxy to submit. It was an intoxicating dream, too good to believe, but Talon had to try. Even if she died, she would die with purpose, far better than empty despair. She took a breath of cool air to clear her head. Yes, she had a purpose still. She was Sith for a little while longer. She waited atop the ledge until Eli approached her, coming up the slanting path from the canyon floor. He stopped a short distance away, eyeing her carefully. "What happened?" he asked. "What's wrong?" Talon held out her hand and showed him the recording rod. "Come inside," she said. "There's something you need to hear." Shortly after Mynock returned from his away mission, C-3PO and R2-D2 completed their tale-telling. The keepers of the Whills retreated into their caves, and everyone else was processing the latest news from elsewhere. The only ones who seemed unaffected were the Yuuzhan Vong guards, who continued stoic vigil around their holy gate as though the latest galactic crisis didn't matter to them. And, Kyra supposed, it didn't. The news had left her restless, though. It felt like the stage was set for something to finally happen on Rahakala, but the Qua seemed as unresolved as ever. She realized the Qua had been around for a while and weren't in any hurry, but the rest of them were, and it was getting on everyone's nerves. Even Lobaka was looking agitated. As they settled into another night, eerie for its starless sky, Kyra ventured close to the gate. The Yuuzhan Vong at his base watched her but didn't move to interfere. With their eyes or the Force, they could tell she was harmless. It was a great arch of rugged stone, maybe 20 meters high at the peak. It could have been mistaken for a freak natural formation. She only spotted a few portions where the stone had been broken away to reveal the ancient machinery beneath. She had no idea where it drew power from or how to trigger it. She couldn't even guess what it looked like when the great artifact turned on. She only knew she felt very small beside it. "We have not spoken yet." The sudden voice made Kyra jump. Her heart was pounding when she looked to her side and saw Khat Lah looking down on her, leathery Yuuzhan Vong face unreadable. She hadn't spoken to other Vong in Canyon, or any Vong at all, not in all her life. She waited for her heart to slow down before she replied, "I didn't think we have anything to talk about." "And why did you think that?" It sounded like such a stupid question. Kyra was a nobody. Her parents were dead, and she'd spent most of the past 5 years living in a junkyard. The only reason she was here now was an unlikely combination of now sterile midichlorians and the kindness of strangers. She hugged herself awkwardly as she found a response. Well, I get why you talked to Skywalker. And Jo and Lobaka, since they're knights. Even the Sith. But me, I'm kind of along for the ride. Skywalker said the Force moves through you. It moved, past tense, and only a little. I never even knew I had it until right before it was taken away. Were you given training? No, nothing formal. Just a lesson or two from Jo. She smiled sadly. We were going to practice more, but something messed with our plans. And what did you want to achieve? Did you want to become a Jedi? An Imperial Knight? Honestly, I didn't think about that in detail. I just wanted to be more than what I was. There seemed no reason not to tell the truth, or at least to some of it. My life was opening up then after I'd been trapped for a long time, and I got this glimpse of something that was so much more than I'd ever imagined, only to get it slapped away. It didn't seem fair. I thought I had to fix it. Honesty came easily. She wondered if Khat Lah was using the Force on her, or if she just needed to get those words out. Despite his size and alien features, Khat Lah didn't seem dangerous to her. There seemed to be a weary calm about him, like he'd seen so much already that nothing could rile him. What were you before you learned to use the Force? She exhaled. It's kind of a story, and not really interesting. Tell me, please. Kyra told him. She mentioned her childhood on Sviverin, what little she remembered. Her throat welled a little as she described the attack that had leveled part of the capital city, collapsed their apartment block, and killed her parents. She listed off the planets and ports she drifted through, just one more child left orphaned by the war, uncared for and unnoticed except by beings who wanted to use her. She described the streets gangs she'd run with on a handful of outer rim backwaters before finally stowing away on a ship and ending up on Socorro, fixing broken vehicles for a kindly Herglick until a bounty hunter had shot Rugo Dade and left her to run the jump shop and to shoulder the debt to Rav. Finally, she told him about Ania and Jo and Cade, about how they'd whisked her away to freedom and given her all those things she dreamed of having but never thought she could. When she was done, Khat Lah gave a thoughtful hum. Are you a believer in destiny? Kyra blinked. I don't think so. My life never looked like it was going in any special direction. I just tried to survive. The way I see it, I ended up here because of luck. Or, he said, the will of the Force. Does the Force have a will? She asked, slight tremor to her voice. I've heard Jo and even Skywalker talk about it, but I wasn't never sure if meant it literally. I don't think they know either. But you. When she trailed off, he asked, what? You know things, right? Things you haven't even told Skywalker yet. I do. And even I have much to learn. Okay, she said. I guess we've got one thing in common then. Indeed. His thin lips peeled back to show a pointy-toothed smile. And would you like to touch the Force again, even if it brings you danger? She swallowed. Yes. I wouldn't have come all this way if I hadn't. And if you had the Force again, what would you do? An answer leaped to mind. There's a lot of things wrong in the galaxy right now. It sounds like they're tipping to another war. That shouldn't happen. Jo tells me the point of having the Force is bringing peace and justice to people who don't have it. And is that the role you want? Someone has to do it. The Force is a gift. I won't pretend to know all you can do with it, but if you've got it, you shouldn't waste it. You sound very certain. I've lived through a lot of bad stuff. Other people shouldn't have to. And it would be your duty to save them from it. His voice was skeptical, but she nodded. If I have special power, that's how I'd use it. Very well. Khat Lah took a breath and looked up at the arch. After consulting with the keepers of the Whills, I have made a decision. We will open the hypergate tomorrow, and you will pass through it. Me? Kyra stared. Yes, you? And Cade Skywalker. His voice went hard. And Eli Horn. Together, you three will join me on the other side of the gate. Chapter 9. Given the motley mix of starships parked at the settlement on Concord Down, which already included a CC light hauler, a Mandal Motors attack ship, and slant-wing Consair Scout one old Corellian disc-shaped freighter fit in pretty well. The ship, called Scarlet Star, was their visitor from Admiral Bay's fugitive fleet, and to Ania's surprise, his pilot had come alone. When Hondo Carr raised the point, Anjdal smiled and shrugged. I asked for a co-pilot, but the Admiral turned me down. Turns out I'm expendable. I highly doubt that. Hondo grinned and pulled her in for a short hug. Ania knew Hondo had been a Rogue Squadron pilot while on the run from Yaga Arches. He seemed to have made comrades in arms even on side jobs. Ania had met Anj briefly, back on the Empress flagship during their excursion to Greece space last year. That felt forever ago, but Anj remembered Ania, and she certainly remembered AG-37. The only one she didn't seem to know was Marin, and if she had any suspicion the older woman was Ania's mother and a Skywalker, she didn't let it show. That was good, because Ania was pretty sure Ganner was piecing it together. The truth would probably out sooner or later, and she'd have to talk with her mother about getting the inevitable over with. Right now, though, everyone gathered in the settlement's convocation hall. They sat along a stretched-out table like kids at a cafeteria, but their conversation was great. Ganner and Aslan told their whole story, and Anj took it in with periodic nods and no comments. After that, Ania explained what they'd gotten from their run to Mirkor. After sufficiently counting the smuggler nest they disturbed, the criminals had handed over their data tracking ships coming and going from Mirkor over the past month, which was as far back as their records went. In all that time, the lonely planet had been visited by only a handful of ships not connected to the smugglers themselves. An OCC Action 6 transport had set down on the forest world and lifted off a standard day later. A refitted Soro Suub yacht had flown one orbit and left without touching ground, and a big Demorian bulk hauler had skirted the edge of the gravity well before promptly jumping elsewhere. And then there was the Income IC-2 scout ship that had made 2 visits to the planet, spending 6 hours on the ground each time. The visits had been spaced 10 standard days apart, and the more recent one had taken place at roughly the same time as Marasiah Fel's supposed assassination. IC-2s are common civilian ships, but Imperial intelligence likes to use them too, Ganner said. They're quick and inconspicuous. They're not big, either, said Anj. How many of those Isle-Watsits do you think they could fit on one? Ganner shrugged awkwardly. The creatures themselves are less than a meter nose to tail. It's the plants they need to live that are difficult to raise off-world. Well, if they're going to be holding Marasiah Fel indefinitely, they'll need to keep making trips. I imagine they're pretty well supplied, but they might still come back. Anj looked to Ania. Do you think your new friends can give us a tip-off if they come back? I understand they'll be vacating the moon, Ania said, but nothing stops us from dropping a sensor buoy in orbit. It can alert us the next time the IC-2 or anything else stops by. That's a good plan. You should get on that right away. She glanced at the Imperial Knights. Any chance you can find help on Coruscant? We think we can trust Tree Sende, leader of the Imperial Knights, Aslan explained. But lines of communication to him are probably monitored. We'll need to try and reach him in person. You mean go to Coruscant? Anj looked between the two. No offense, but if you want to go incognito, you'll need to do more than just ditch the armor. I realize I'm not the best for the job, Aslan said, with a small frown on her scarred face. Ganner and I have talked this over. He'll be the one to insert on Coruscant. I was going to say he's the preferable option. But again, you'll need to do more than ditch the armor. Ganner frowned. I'm not that recognizable, am I? Anj's eyes darted up and down. 2 meters tall, pasty white skin, long red ponytail. That's 3 marks against you. Aslan smiled softly. She's got you there. All right. I'll do something about the hair. He touched his red locks like he feared to lose them. Good. You probably shouldn't go alone. Anj looked to Hondo and Tez. I've seen these 2 in a firefight. They're pretty good. We're better than good, Hondo said, but didn't volunteer his services. Ania figured this was where she came in. I know you don't want to take on the entire Federation, Hondo. We don't either. I've still got some credits left. How about I pay you and whoever you want to bring along to guard Ganner's body? Hondo and Tess exchanged reluctant looks. A G-37 said, whatever Ania offers to pay you, I will match it. Everyone looked at him. His red photoreceptors pulsed thoughtfully, and he added, maintenance on free agent is relatively inexpensive, so I have most of my bounty left over. Ange looked between her and the droid. How did you two get loaded? Long story, Ania waved a hand. The point is, Hondo, will you take our contract? With the droid throwing in, how can I refuse? The Mando threw up his hands in surrender. All right. We can guard your body, Imp Vod. Don't do anything stupid so we have to rescue you. I'll try not to, Ganner said seriously. Ange thought a moment, hesitated, then said, there's someone else on Coruscant who I think can help us. Moni again? The senator? Asked Salk. And another old rogue? Hondo said. You tried contacting her on our freak. Ange shook her head. Too risky. We can be sure Chalk's monitoring every transmission she gets. She'll be a hard one to talk to, but if possible, I think she should know about all this. What kind of help do you think she could get us? Asked Aslan. I don't know, but if anyone on Coruscant could help besides Send, it would be her. Salk raised one flipper, like a student to be called on. I have an idea. Go ahead, Ania said. Last time we were on Coruscant, I met up with some Mon-Cal refugee relief organizations. I gave them donations and talked to their leadership. I know for a fact some of them have Senator Gaines' ear. Ange nodded eagerly. Sounds like the perfect messenger, so long as they can talk to Moni at some place that's not bugged. We've got jammers that can block surveillance devices, Hondo said. No problem there. Not a bad plan, Ania said. Who knew being philanthropic could help you down the line? Virtue is supposed to be its own reward, said Salk. Is it? Well, I like this kind of reward better. She looked to Ange. So here's the big part. When we go to bust Marasiah from wherever they have her, what can we expect from the Alliance? After an increasingly enthusiastic conversation, the pilot's expression fell. I'm not sure if there's anything we can offer you. What do you mean? Aslan asked. If we free Marasiah, we discredit their entire case against Stasi. We discredit Chalk. This is a win for everyone. I already made that argument to Admiral Bay. He's skeptical. Of what? Ganner said, suddenly angry. If we expose Chalk's lie, there's no telling how he'll react. He might lock down and declare martial law. He might just shoot Stasi and the senator. So you do nothing. That's not fair. Marasiah is the rightful leader of us all. So is Gar Stasi. They're both legal heads of the Galactic Federation, or they were, until last week. They still are, Ganner insisted. Aslan, a little calmer, said, the Empress always tried to deal with your people fairly. She deserves your support. I'm giving you support just by being here, but you can't expect us to commit to anything, especially now, when don't have any facts. We don't even know Fel is alive, not for sure. Why else would they be harvesting isolamary? Asked Marin. The galaxy isn't flush with Force users nowadays. The irony of that thankfully went over Ange's head. I don't know why. None of us knows anything, which is my point. Maybe if you people can come up with a really good plan, where the Alliance stands to benefit as much as you. She trailed off. Ganner shook his head and his face twisted in a scowl. Alliance versus Empire. Still, after all we've been through. What happened to the Federation? It was a nice idea, Ange said softly. Those tend to run hard against reality. It could still work, if we get the Empress and Stasi both freed, Aslan said. I'm willing to plead our case to Admiral Bay himself, if you will let me. Ange sighed, but nodded. I expected you would be. That's why I came in something roomier than a crossfire. I'd like to go too, Ania said. The other woman regarded her. How much she knew about Ania and Marasiah's relationship, sporadic and tense as it had been, she didn't say, but she nodded. Scarlet Star's got room for plenty of passengers. We're only using my ship, You understand? Operational security. We understand perfectly, said AG-37. Ania, if you don't mind, I'd like to recuse myself from your side in this instance. Instead, I think another duty calls. No offense, but you're not coming to Coruscant, interrupted Hondo. If you're traveling incognito, don't bring a 3-meter-tall assassin droid. That was not my intention. I was going to take free agent and deposit a sentinel buoy over Mirker. Good thinking, AG, said Salk. Then it looks like everyone's got a part, and said, I'll let you boys and girls get stuff finalized. Take your time. I'm going back to my ship to ping the fleet. That was almost true. Ania's mother had been mostly silent during the conversation, and she didn't clarify anything in the talk that followed. That was mostly Hondo and Tez brainstorming over which Mando buddies to take on the team to Coruscant. After they stepped out to make some calls, Salk and AG-37 retreated to free agent and the Imperial Knights went back to their ship. It was down to mother and daughter again. Well, Ania asked, tell me what you're thinking. Watching the distance, Marin said, I think I should go to Coruscant. Ania had been readying herself for that. Going to see your old friend, Treese. He wasn't my friend, and I might not even meet him. The thing is, Ganner and Hondo and Tez might find out where Marasiah is and scout it every way you can think of, but they'll never see things the way I do. Does that matter with those isolamary things? I don't know. I've never actually dealt with them before, but I've heard they create this vacuum in the Force. A bubble of emptiness. If I can sense beings disappearing and reappearing as they go in and out of the bubble. I get it. It makes sense. On your pause. I guess this is where I say may the Force be with you. It is. It always has been, I think, even when I didn't want it. Her mother looked thoughtfully into the tabletop. Ania ventured. It sounds like more trouble than it's worth, overall. I thought that for a while. But not anymore. Well, you heard what Jael said. They found Khat Lah and some ancient Force gateway thing. Maybe everyone else will get it back too. I noticed you didn't tell Ange about that. Well, what's to tell? I figure that's Force user business. Doesn't have to do anything with the mess we're in. If the Force hadn't gone silent, we'd never be in this mess at all. It'd be nice if it got us out of it. Yes, it would. Marin tilted her head back like she was examining the ceiling, or maybe something higher. Ania knew when there was nothing left to say, and she quietly excused herself. There wasn't room in their ship to do what had to be done, so they borrowed the refresher in the main house instead. The mirror by the sink was cracked in one corner and dirty on the edges, but Ganner was nonetheless able to watch as he chopped off his own ponytail, then handed the shears to Azlyn. She cut his hair even closer to the scalp, shedding long red locks across his shoulders, before finally taking a borrowed automatic razor and shaving him bare to the scalp. Ganner watched it all happen in the mirror, but when she was done, the man staring back at him still looked like a stranger. You don't like it, Azlyn said as she brushed his shoulders clean. It's strange. If you can't recognize yourself, I doubt chalk spotters will. She ran a hand lightly across the gleaming white of his head. It's not bad, just different. Her smile was soft, maybe even playful. It roused in him some of his old fondness for Azlyn, his old desire. Events had twined the two of them close together lately, but it had become hard to think of her as he once had. Romantic longing required a seed of hope, and everything in the past year losing the Force, then Antares, then Marasiah had combined to steal his hope away. He found himself embarking on this mission not because he believed it would succeed, but because he had no place else to go. Azlyn was different. It was strange that she, who'd been so long torn between Jedi and Imperial Knights, had adapted to losing the Force better than him. Maybe it was because that dilemma had been removed that she found herself free to act on her own conscience. For Ganner, it seemed like everything that had given his life purpose had been successively taken from him. Hey, Azlyn said, brushing a strand from his cheek, it's not so bad. And you can always grow it long again, in a year or two. Still staring at his own eyes, Ganner gave a brittle smile. It should be a good disguise. Do you know how you'll contact Master Sende? I have ideas. Well, I'm not sure how I'll get through to Admiral Bay, but I'll have to come up with something. I'm sure you'll do fine, Aslan. Really? Really? He smiled again, a little stronger. He had more faith in her than himself. She placed both hands on his shoulders. Just keep your head on straight. Don't take any risks. And don't jump out of an airspeeder when it's a couple 100 feet in the air. She said it with a joking smile, but he'd done just that on their trip to Vorzit V. He'd let his grief and frustration boil to the surface. It had ruined his judgment, ruined the mission, and nearly gotten him killed. His shattered leg still wasn't completely healed. I'll exercise discretion this time, he said. That's all I ask. Aslan lifted her hands away, but the feeling of warmth remained. He tried to cling to that feeling. He'd need his memory in the days ahead. The Alliance renegades were sparing no precaution. After leaving the Afrin system, Sare and Porat flew to a set of coordinates located in open space at the edge of the Tapani sector. After waiting at the rendezvous point for a 10 standard hour, a single Noon-class shuttle dropped out of hyperspace and transmitted half of a passcode. Only after Porat transmitted the other half did the shuttle move close enough to couple airlocks with theirs. As requested, they'd emptied the ship of all their belongings and wiped its computers. A pair of Alliance soldiers escorted them through the airlock and to the shuttle cockpit. They watched stars pan and shift, and saw the ship that had carried them off Coruscant sitting alone in the black. They watched the Alliance shuttle fire off a short chain of laser blasts that tore through the unshielded hull, ignited the fuel core, and turned their ship into a fireball that cooled slowly to debris. The adage about burning your bridges had never felt so literal. Even then, the Alliance troops were careful. By Sare's count, the shuttle took 5 separate lightspeed jumps over the course of 11 hours, which meant their final destination could have been in a dozen different sectors. She and Porat waited patiently in the shuttle's passenger cabin the entire time. The Alliance troops who warded them seemed excited to have them aboard, but had apparently been ordered to say little. They were allowed back inside the cockpit after the last hyperspace jump. The shuttle had already plunged into the midst of a sprawling fleet. Sare looked closely and counted 7 Mon Calamari cruisers, with probably a few more out of visual range. Alliance was a fitting centerpiece to the formation, a proud white wedge emblazoned with Alliance crest on either flank. She remembered Lord Crate's wrath after the ship, originally named Imperius, had been stolen. The Dark Lord had slaughtered dozens of Mon Calamari on a public broadcast, including former Alliance Triumvir Jyle Gayan. After that, he'd initiated the purges that had culminated in the genocide of Dak. Sari remembered that her father had been upset by Crate's actions, not their brutality, but their recklessness. He later told her that was the first time he'd considered usurping the Dark Lord's throne. If the Alliance had never stolen this ship, her father might not have betrayed Crate. The one Sith might still rule the galaxy. Darth Maladi might not have gone mad and severed them all from the Force. Sari herself might now be training to be the 4th Darth Wyerlock, loyal serval of the immortal Crate. She banished those thoughts. If you started asking what if there was no end to it. The Alliance shuttle dipped below Alliance's broad superstructure and flew into a ventral hangar bay near its nose. She saw an honor guard arrayed to greet them, lines of blue-clad Alliance soldiers, though no officers were visible. After they landed, Porat and Sare were escorted down the ramp and onto the deck, where a single Sarean soldier was waiting with a small portable device in hand. Porat seemed to know exactly what was happening. He took a step forward and held his hands at his sides. The Sarean, whose cone-topped head reached nearly as high as Porat's horns, held the device in front of the Chagrian's eye. A retinal scanner, Sare thought. Apparently Alliance's shipboard computer still had registry information for old crewmen on its databanks. Once the Sarean took his scan, he stepped back and checked his device. Finally, his face relaxed to a smile and he snapped a brisk salute. "Welcome aboard, Senator. It's good to have you back." "It's good to be back," Porat said, looking around the hangar. "My wife, Sare. It's good to have you as well, madam. I'm sorry for the security procedures, but we wanted to be absolutely sure." "There's nothing wrong with caution," We're up against a canny enemy, said Porat. May I speak with Admiral Bay? He's waiting for you, Senator. Right this way. A handful of soldiers fell in around Porat and Saray as the Syrian escorted them down the halls and onto a rail car that whisked them toward the after of the 3-kilometer-long destroyer, then up lift to the command level. Admiral Bay was waiting for them in the conference room. The broad-shouldered Wiki had a friendly smile on his leathery face, and he shook Porat's and Saray's hands in turn. I'm so glad you're here, Bay said. You'll have to tell me how you managed to escape arrest. Pure luck, Porat replied. They were never going to tell anyone the full story. I only wish the others could have been so fortunate. I heard they arrested Stasi on the ground at Bakura before anyone knew what was going on. Bay's face turned to a scowl. They did. I had a choice then. They already had him in their clutches, and I could either submit to their authority, I could try and fight, even though they already had him, or I could run. You made the right choice. We couldn't just give in. Porat clasped his arm and gave it a squeeze. Have you decided what your next step is? Unfortunately, no. I'm still hoping to avoid another war. We all are. But we can't let the Imperials destroy our democracy without firing a shot. I don't want that either. You see my dilemma. It's our dilemma now. We can't hope for a miracle that lets us win this fight peacefully, but we need to be prepared for what happens if the miracle doesn't show. I know. Bay's eyes slipped to Saray. It was that same evaluating look she always got. Anything you have to say to me you can say to my wife, Porat said firmly. I've told Stasi the same thing. Yes, he did mention that. Bay nodded acquiescence and gestured to the table. Have a seat, both of you, and I'll explain. Something's come up. The details aren't all clear yet, but I'm hoping they'll give us just the miracle we need. Chapter 10. The opening of the gate felt like it should have been accompanied with more fanfare. Instead, the hours before were strangely mundane. Yuuzhan Vong removed pieces of his stone frame to access and check the ancient machinery inside. Several Qua supervised them, reading from scraps of parchment that must have been ancient instruction manuals, probably copied and recopied over generations as the parchment itself crumbled to dust. This place was so old it beggared the mortal concept of time, it seemed impossible it should exist at all. The technical details of the thing bothered Cade less than the rest. As he watched the Yuuzhan Vong and Qua run checks, he stood beside Khat Lah with arms crossed and a heavy backpack resting against planted feet. He hadn't been told much of what he'd find on the other side, but Khat Lah had suggested he bring rations, tools, a medical kit, and his lightsaber. Cade had packed everything from Minox's emergency kit until his bag weighed 20 kilos. He hoped it would be enough. He heard a noise behind him and glanced over his shoulder. Kyra, with a heavy pack of her own, crossed the canyon floor and followed R2-D2 as the astromech rolled up a slanting pathway and climbed toward one of the caves nestled in the stone wall. When she was out of sight, he turned back to the gate and asked Khat Lah, "Are you sure you made the right choice in traveling companions?" "I have already explained my reasoning." "Well, explain it again." "That you should come is obvious. The Force has stayed with you when it has abandoned the others. As the descendant of the Chosen One, you may be able to see things on the other side the rest of us cannot. You may even be able to speak directly with the Whills." He thought back to his experience inside the Loyur and frowned. "I'm not exactly looking forward to the conversation." "It must be ventured. If anyone can speak to them, it would be one who carries the essence of the Chosen One." "Yeah, I get that," he sighed. "I noticed a couple Qua made a big deal about me being a Skywalker. Struck me as kind weird, seeing as there were no Skywalkers the last time anybody paid them a visit. The prophecy of the Chosen One is far older than Anakin Skywalker." "Yeah, I know. But anyway, forget about me. I'm more worried about the other ones. I still don't see why we are not taking Lobaka and Jayo. The Whills exist in a state beyond what our individual minds can conceive. The closer we get to them, the more line between self and others will blur. I'm concerned about powerful individuals having an overwhelming effect. Lobaka especially." "But you're taking me? You are a Skywalker." Did I ever mention how sick I am of people telling me that? Khat Lah glanced at him sidelong. I do not think that you are. I knew your grandmother. She did not embrace her name either, but again and again she used her powers and did what had to be done. I ain't my grandma. She was nicer than me. Perhaps. But you have come this far. Cade sighed. I thought we were done talking about me. Tell me about Kyra. She's a good enough kid, but she barely knows anything about the Force. I don't even know much raw power she has. That is something we can learn. I have talked to her. She has endured much, but she had a righteous heart. They got a saying about roads paved by good intentions. Indeed. But without them, we travel nowhere at all. We can see how she reacts when her powers are reawakened. We can direct them and direct her on the right path. Well, that sounds charitable. He moved hands to his hips. Now tell me about Eli. He's the one I'm really worried about. He has also been wounded, more deeply than Kyra. The Sith found him broken and rearranged him in their image, but they haven't remade him. If anything, he stands on the brink of breaking again. I notice he and Talon haven't reacted well to news of the Sith being wiped out. Cade couldn't help but grin. Still, the kid's got all sorts of bad in him. I got sympathy for his pain, believe me, but I really don't think this is the time and place to try turning a Sith apprentice good again. That was putting it mildly. Khat Lah said, You think I am letting guilt dictate my actions? I know you watched over the kid after his dad died, but he made his own choices. The Force ain't a cure-all. The only one who can fix Eli is Eli. I agree, but his best chance of conversion lies through the gate. I will do everything I can to guide him, and so will you. I will I? With your powers? Yeah, but no. I get I have the magic genes or aura of the chosen one, but I'm not him. I can't work miracles, and I can't just tell the whole branch of Force to do my bidding. That, Khat Lah said, is a matter of debate. Cade turned full toward him. The Yuuzhan Vong looked as serious as ever. Oh, come on, he sighed. There is something you should see before we depart. Khat Lah bent low, plucked Cade's pack, and swung it over one shoulder. Come. Cade didn't budge. Where are we going? Not far. Come, he repeated. We can collect Kyra on the way. Kyra hadn't spent much time in the caves and tunnels carved into the canyon wall. She'd preferred Minix, more familiar in sights. As she followed R2-D2 through the torch-lit passages, she started to realize there was the equivalent of small village here. There would have to be, she supposed, if the keepers of the Whills had been hiding here for millennia. She still didn't know how many of the Qua there were on Rahakala. Less than 24 appeared on the surface at any time, but there seemed enough underground space for far more. She didn't know their lifespans, or how big the population had to be to safely reproduce and promulgate itself down the centuries. Maybe there were other Qua hiding out on other planets, and maybe other hypergates too. She knew when they reached their destination by R2's triumphant tweet and the gleam of C-3PO in the Astromech's headlight. The protocol droid shifted at the sound and turned to face them. Ah, Mistress Kyra. I was so hoping to see you before you departed. You're going to miss me, are you, Sleepy? Just saying the droid's old nickname made her smile. When she found the battered head and torso in Rugo's junk shop, its cogitation matrix had been so damaged it could only speak in slow, somnolent syllables. He'd been just one piece of trash among many, but he'd been the closest thing she had to a friend after Rugo's murder. Kyra had never imagined that her broken droid could be tied to something so great. Maybe she did have some kind of destiny after all. Her pack was getting heavy, and she swung it off her shoulders to the ground. Only as she stretched her back did she look around the cavern and realized how large it was. The main floor was the size of a springball court, and the walls rose up in 4 tiers. The stone walls had been carved into shelves, and on the shelves were hundreds of volumes of bound parchment. I take it, Mistress Kyra, that this is your first time being here, C-3PO said, shuffling to one side so she could get a look at the wooden table behind him. Loose sheets were spread across it, and half hunched over them was a robed Qua. The alien lifted his head and released a series of unintelligible hissing sounds. Mistress Kyra, said C-3PO, please meet Ekavis, the Keeper's designated archivist. He says he is quite pleased to meet you. Ekavis was happy to record my tale, and is currently adding to their journal of the Whills. R2D2 blurted rudely. C-3PO gave a good imitation of a human sigh and said, yes, R2, we told our story together. R2 chirped again. Well, yes, I admit you had somewhat more material to add than I, but it wasn't my fault I've suffered a memory wipe and a near-fatal accident. Not all droids are blessed with your remarkable good fortune. C-3PO heaved another mock sigh and looked to Kyra. The Keepers were quite interested in our story, actually, since it's been so long since they received visitors. In addition to translating, I also had to make some changes to temper R2's embellishments. What kind of embellishments? I should say, his self-aggrandizing tendencies. If you listen to him, you'd think he destroyed the Death Star himself. C-3PO's head swung back and forth. His ego can be very frightful sometimes. Thankfully, I was able to set the record straight. R2D2 stayed diplomatically silent. Kyra titled her head back and took in the tiers of bookshelves. Looks like they've quite a collection. Why, mistress, these volumes are all the journal of the Whills. They have been keeping it since they established this colony on Khat Lah some 25,000 years ago. Kyra almost laughed. She could barely imagine 25 years. 1,000 times that was way too much. Yeah, I can see why they need lots of storage space. The Keepers have been guarding this history the entire time, C-3PO said admiringly. When volumes become so aged they start to disintegrate, the skilled archivist copies it verbatim to a new parchment, thus ensuring a continuous and accurate historical record going back farther than anything in the galaxy. I imagine even the Gree archives on Tehasa can't compare. Well, Kyra thought silently, if you were stuck in this hole for 25 millennia, you need something to fill the time. She was about to phrase that more kindly when footsteps pounded the rock behind her. She looked around as Cade Skywalker came through the entrance, followed by Khat Lah. Cade stopped in his tracks, put hands on his hips, looked around, and said, a library. I was never big on libraries. Welcome, Master Cade, C-3PO said cordially. As I was just explaining to Mistress Kyra, this chamber contains every volume of the Journal of the Whills, dating back to its inception approximately 25,000 years ago. Oh, is that all? Cade feigned disappointment. Is that all? C-3PO flustered. I dare say, Master Cade, perhaps you don't fully understand what an astonishing find this is from any point of. I get it. Cade waved a hand. I'm just kidding, Professor. Oh, said the droid. I see. In that case, please let me introduce you to Ekavis, who is currently transcribing all the information R2 and I provided to the journal. The Qua lifted his head from the parchment and hissed. He says he is honored to meet the Chosen One, C-3PO translated. I'm not the carking Chosen One. Cade sighed and looked back to Khat Lah. What are we here for, anyway? Khat Lah opened his mouth and made some hissing noises of his own. Ekavis apparently understood, because the Qua stalked over to a shelf in the back of the room and returned with the bound volume. It flipped through the pages with three clawed hands while the others gathered close. To Kyra, each page was a jumble of unreadable alien glyphs. I think we're gonna need your help, Professor, Kay said. Of course, C-3PO said, and when the Qua stopped flipping pages, he leaned in for a closer look. Yes, I see. Aha. How interesting. And when is this particular entry from? Ekavis hissed reply. Indeed. Why, that is indeed extraordinary. What's extraordinary? Asked Kyra. This passage, mistress. It reads, in the time of darkness a child will be born, a vessel for the Force, darkness will be banished, his descendants will hold the balance. Words on a page? Cade muttered. Indeed, but this is a precise copy of the original journal entry, which dates back to approximately 14.5 millennia ago. It certainly seems to have notable similarities to the traditional Jedi Order's prophecy of the Chosen One. The thing about prophecies is that they're nice and vague. Cade shook his head. They leave all sorts of open holes you can pour in with whatever you want to read. Perhaps, Khat Lah said, but you sons and daughters of Skywalker can use the Force, where others cannot. Clearly there is some truth to it. Yeah, well, Cade shrugged awkwardly. Like I said, it's all vague. Mentions of the Chosen One are scattered throughout the Journal of the Whills, the Yuuzhan Vong said, followed by Quahissus Free Cavis. The Keeper hissed back, apparently in agreement. What's going on? Kyra asked C-3PO. How interesting, said the droid. It seems that Cavis will begin searching through the archives for other references to the Chosen One in hopes of compiling a proper catalog by the time you return from your expedition. Sounds like a lot of work. Cade patted the droid's shoulder plate. Oh, indeed, Master Cade. According to my calculations, there are 2,971 distinct volumes on these shelves. To go over them all and mark any relevant and possibly relevant would take Cavis at least 3.5 standard weeks. Unless he has help. Well, naturally the division of labor. And once he finds those passages, we'll need him in basic. That goes without saying, but. So in other words, this sounds like just the job for you, Professor. Cade slapped his shoulder. Have fun while we're gone. Oh, C-3PO's mechanical voice trembled, oh my. Cade patted his Astromach's dome. Take care of him, will you, R2? The droid tweeted affirmative, followed by a lower noise, almost cooing. Yeah, I'll miss you too, buddy. Cade looked to Kyra. You packed and ready? I am, she said, turning eyes to the heavy pack on the floor. Then let's get a move on. We've waited long enough. Kyra looked to Khat Lah, the back to Cade, and nodded. The Yuuzhan Vong and the Jedi were heading out. Kyra bent low to retrieve her own pack and strapped it over both shoulders before following them through the tunnels. Per Khat Lah's instructions, she's provided herself with 2 weeks' worth of food bland rations, mostly, and a pack of emergency medical supplies. Khat Lah had insisted she not bring weapons, and she'd followed his order. She'd only slipped in one object besides those recommended. Back on Socorro, during the frantic escape from Rav's treasure house, an object had fallen into her hands. Though she'd never told anyone else she'd had it, she gathered from Lobacca that the smooth-sided Black Pyramid was a Sith holocron once some ancient dark-side wizard had used to record black wisdom inside. She hadn't known that when she first recovered the artifact. At the time, she'd merely touched it and mystic light had seeped from its edges and converged in the form of a hooded woman. It had been strange and wondrous, her first hint of the larger world to which she belonged, and even though she knew better now, she recalled that feeling when she'd run her force-deft fingers over the smooth surface and stuck it in her bag. She knew it was dangerous, but she also knew better than to listen to whatever the long-dead Sith woman had to say. She just wanted to touch it one more time and have it spark to life beneath her fingers. When that happened, she'd know the Force was truly with her, and she could finally do great things. At just the weight on her shoulders, Kyra quickened her pace and followed her guides toward the gate. When the time came to activate the gate, dozens of Qua emerged from the warrens and gathered before the arch in what seemed to be reverence. The Yuuzhan Vong gathered as well, and so did the motley collection of seekers who'd found their way to Rahikala. Cade Skywalker shared a kiss with Delia and a backslapping hug with Jerry, then a big furry handshake with Lobacca. Kyra engaged Jo in a more solemn embrace. Khat Lah said quiet farewells to his own companions, some of whom snapped wrists to shoulders in the Yuuzhan Vong salute. Eli had no one to say goodbye to him, but he'd expected that. The closest he had was Talon, who stood apart from the others and watched only him. He'd accepted Khat Lah's offer to take him through the gate without understanding and without hesitation. His master had been less than pleased. After sharing with him news of the Sith's apparent destruction, she'd whispered to him her plan of fighting past the guards, retaking their ship, flying out of the system, and calling whatever Sith survived to this place where they'd take the gate by force. The plan reeked of desperation. Even Talon knew it. Maybe they would have been able to fight their way free together, Even alone, she might stand a chance if she caught her warders by surprise. He told her he might not be gone long, because time moved faster on the other side of the gate. But as he stood before it, heavy pack on his shoulders, he felt like he was going on a journey he might not come back from. Eli found he was okay with that. Without either the Sith or the Force, he felt like he was standing at the edge of an abyss. Now he might get the ladder back. He had to take it. After everyone extricated from their goodbyes, they joined Eli before the towering arch. Khat Lah looked the young man over and snapped, "No. That lightsaber is not allowed." He touched at the weapon clipped to his belt. "It's mine," he said. "I built it. You will not need it where you are going." Eli was going to point out that Skywalker had his weapon but fought the urge. There was no point in starting this with a fight. He removed his lightsaber with one hand and twisted it in his palm, savoring the feeling for perhaps the last time. Lobaka took a few steps forward, ready to retrieve it. Before he got close, Eli whipped his arm overhead and threw. The lightsaber twirled high, then fell into Darth Talon's waiting hand. Skywalker and Jo scowled, and Lobaka whuffed disappointment, but Talon grasped the weapon tight. Her stern face didn't change, but Eli felt he'd made small amends. "Okay," he said, turning back to Khat Lah. "Are we ready now?" "We are." "Then how do we start this thing?" It was something he'd long wondered. In all the research and archival material he'd read, nobody had ever been able to figure out how to turn these hypergates on. "Simple," the Yuuzhan Vong said. "We call on the Force." He turned to the gate, closed his eyes, and raised a hand toward it. Tense silence fell over the canyon. Nothing seemed to be happening, but Eli turned around to see the every surrounding Kwa, and Yuuzhan Vong repeating the same gesture. The newcomers looked around, mostly in confusion. Delia seemed frightened and Jeria anxious. Eli saw his hand go instinctively to his blaster. Then he looked at Cade. Whatever force power swirled mutely around Eli, Skywalker heard it in full. His face had gone slack, his eyes wide in wonder. Flickers of emotion played across it, and for a moment it looked like he was about to cry, though whether it was from sadness or joy or unspeakable beauty, Eli didn't know. The Force still didn't touch him. Without noticing it at first, Eli heard a faint humming sound. Finally, it became loud enough to draw his attention away from the audience and back to the gate. Pinpoints of light had appeared around the arch's interior, breaking through the rock at regular intervals. The humming grew louder still until it seemed to rattle the canyon floor and the teeth in his jaw. Straight lines of light shot out from the pinpoints, crisscrossing to form a perfect grid that filled the arch. The beams grew brighter and swelled wider, closing the perfect square gaps in the grid until the great portal was a wall of blazing light. Khat Lah lowered his hand, opened his eyes, and said, "Now it is time to go." He stepped forward first, followed by Skywalker. Eli and Kyra started forward together. He glanced sidelong at the young woman and saw her face slack with awe. He wondered if his own fear was showing. The four of them stepped close to the wall of light, their boots forming a perfect line. For a second he thought to run back and flee whatever waited for him: transformation, revelation, destruction. Then Skywalker lifted his foot and took the first step forward. The others followed. Eli took one last breath of mortal air, then moved into the light.